Disclaimer. This video contains spoilers for the Lord of the Rings film trilogy, both theatrical and extended editions. There are time codes in the description if you want to jump around. We all on the same page? Alright, so it begins. The world is changed. I feel it in the water. I feel it in the earth. And I most certainly feel it in bookstores, as linguistic professor J.R.R. Tolkien has just released what many would describe as his magnum opus. A massive trilogy of novels known collectively as... It was an epic 12 years in the making, and the second time Tolkien had brought the world of Middle-earth to readers worldwide. The first time, of course, being the hugely successful children's novel The Hobbit. But despite Lord of the Rings being a sequel to that, it was a fairly unconventional sequel. It was far grander and far darker. This was a story designed to be read by older audiences, as a piece of more grown-up fantasy. The Lord of the Rings chronicled the adventures of Frodo Baggins, as he was set to take a magical ring, the One Ring, to the land of Mordor to destroy it and rid the world of evil. It was a story derived not just from Tolkien's experiences in World War I, but also his desire to create an entirely English mythology, as England had no real myths of its own outside of the stories of King Arthur, and even that was kind of a mishmash of a bunch of different ideas from all across Europe. But it also came from his love of language, a love that inspired the creation of his very own. But it wasn't just about making the language, it was about finding how exactly that language came to be, how it evolved. Like all languages, it changes and morphs as time goes by, which led to the creation of Middle-earth, the world in which these stories inhabited, and it very much so was an entire world. There's a hugely rich history spanning thousands of years across 4 ages. It's a world so densely layered and so rich with detail that despite the grandness of the Lord of the Rings books, they were really only the tip of the iceberg. In fact, throughout his entire life, Tolkien only ever got to reveal a portion of his world. The closest he ever got was through the Silmarillion, and even that wasn't published until 4 years after his death. The Lord of the Rings became a massive success, although that success wasn't felt immediately after its release in the mid-1950s. But by the time the 60s rolled around, fan clubs had emerged, people had finally begun to outwardly express their love for these characters and this massive, sprawling fantasy adventure. In fact, The Lord of the Rings became the second most read book of the 20th century, only trailing behind the Bible. That's a pretty solid silver medal right there. And like everything that reaches that level of success, the question inevitably began to be raised. When will they take Lord of the Rings and make it into a movie? But perhaps it wasn't actually a question of when, but if. Because Tolkien himself expressed that the task of taking his books and trying to adapt them into the more conventional narratives that movies required would be impossible. While he never said the exact words, Tolkien believed that Lord of the Rings was unfilmable. But the stories were just so rich and so vivid that people couldn't help but try, which led to the year 1978. With the release of Ralph Bakshi's animated Lord of the Rings, following to some degree in the footsteps of the Rankin Bass animated Hobbit movie. For the first time, the world of Tolkien had been brought to the big screen, and even saw a fair amount of box office success, becoming the top movie of November 1978. But this only covered Fellowship of the Ring and certain elements of The Two Towers. Despite it being the big screen's first crack at Middle-earth, it really only captured a piece of it. And reviews were largely mixed as well. While it was hailed as an incredibly admirable attempt to bring these larger-than-life stories to the screen, it ultimately fell short of the enormity of the material it was based on. And not long after, in the year 1980, Rankin Bass would return to Middle-earth for The Return of the King, tackling the final chapters of the Lord of the Rings story. But this was only a TV special, and long after its release, Arthur Rankin Jr. would express that it was a mistake to have made it in the first place. Bringing these stories to life was becoming a more daunting prospect by the day. With the numerous attempts having gone by the wayside, it seemed that Tolkien was ultimately right. Lord of the Rings was unfilmable. But eventually, after a long drought, the tide began to change in the year 1995. It was here that an unexpected voice began to join the fray, a voice bellowing from the country of New Zealand, belonging to none other than Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson had already made a name for himself with splatter films like Bad Taste, Meet the Feebles, and Brain Dead, all before changing tune a little bit for the movie Heavenly Creatures, which was actually nominated for the Best Original Screenplay award at that year's Oscars. Peter Jackson, of course, grew up with Lord of the Rings. He was introduced to it as a teenager through the Ralph Bakshi film, all before fully diving into the books himself. But he always assumed that he'd never be the one to bring it to life. He assumed that one day he'd be able to sit back and watch someone else's take on the source material. He'd be a fan watching Lord of the Rings take over movie theaters. But as things were winding down on his next film, The Frighteners, he and partner Fran Walsh wanted to take on a more visual effects heavy project. Something that would utilize the technology that had been pioneered by ILM for Jurassic Park. And eventually they realized that the perfect project to take on to fulfill these goals was none other than The Lord of the Rings. At first, Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh brought the idea to Miramax, as they were kind of under a first-look deal with the company. And while they at first pitched the movie as a trilogy, much like the books, Miramax was unwilling to take that big of a risk, which meant that the trilogy had to be shrunk down into 2 movies. While making 2 movies out of the source material would certainly be a little cramped, it wasn't impossible, so Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh immediately got to work. And while development did hit a hiccup with Peter Jackson nearly set to take on a King Kong movie, those plans ultimately fell through, which meant that Lord of the Rings soon became the top priority. Now, treatments were being written for the 2 films all the way into the year 1997. And once the treatment was done, a third writer, Philippa Boyens, joined the project. She was a huge fan of the books, knowing them backwards and forwards, and was absolutely blown away by the work Jackson and Walsh had done. And from here on, she would join them in expanding this outline into a full screenplay. At the same time, as the script was developing, various locations and ideas were starting to be designed by Weta Workshop, a New Zealand-based props and special effects company headed by Richard Taylor and Tanya Roger. They would create all of the physical and practical effects to bring Middle-earth to life on camera, and the work they were doing was already spectacular. And a fair amount of it was inspired by art drawn by John Howe and Alan Lee, who had both been drawing Tolkien art for years for official book releases, calendars, merchandise. They had become some of the foremost voices in bringing these written ideas to visual life. And since the film crew was using their art so much for the movies, they decided to go one step further and actually track down John Howe and Alan Lee and hire them as part of the crew. It was a no-brainer, perhaps the easiest job they'd ever said yes to. And right at the end of the year, John Howe and Alan Lee officially joined the project as concept designers. With their extensive knowledge of Tolkien and their own visual fidelity, they'd be able to give the production this sense of authenticity. Things were on a roll now, some of the key people were in place, the 2 scripts were being developed, and energy only built as the clock turned to the year 1998. But it was here that problems began to rear their ugly head. Because eventually, notorious, not at all problematic producer Harvey Weinstein, one of the founders of Miramax, became increasingly concerned about the ballooning budget of the 2 films. Because of this, despite the fact that the machine was already rolling, scripts were being written, and props and miniatures were already being designed and sculpted, everything was soon going to be ground down to a halt. Because Weinstein and Miramax eventually proposed that to keep the budget of the films down, the production would shrink to 1 movie. Now at first you might think, oh, they'll make one of the movies, then if it proves successful, they'll make a second one. But no. This would shrink the entire story into 1 movie. The entire trilogy in one big go. Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens were all gutted, because they knew that a story this rich and detailed couldn't possibly be shrunk down into 1 2-hour movie and still be in any way satisfying. And so, the team parted ways with Miramax, halting the film's development right in its tracks. This left them with one option. They had to find another studio to take on the project, a studio that was willing to make 2 films and pay Harvey Weinstein $20 million to cover his investment. You know, that's not too big of an ask, right? Despite the dire prospects, however, the team made a cheery, upbeat, and fun 35-minute documentary about everything that they had already made for the project. It was designed as a pitch video to sell the idea of these movies to anyone that would be interested. But because of the extremity of this request, studios across Hollywood turned down Lord of the Rings one by one. They weren't interested, which was doubly a shame because they didn't even watch the 35-minute documentary. I mean, come on, you gotta watch that first, at least. But they didn't. Nearly every studio that they proposed the idea to had turned it down, which left the entire team with one horrible and gut-wrenching thought. This was it. This was the end of Lord of the Rings. But a light began to shine from the end of the tunnel because suddenly they had one final chance. This is where Mark Ordesky, an executive at New Line Cinema, became involved. He was a friend of Peter Jackson and had heard about this project, so he pulled some strings to secure a meeting between Peter Jackson and New Line CEOs Robert Shea and Michael Lynn. This was the final chance. This was the final studio it needed to work out. It was here that the 35-minute documentary video was finally screened, and the pitch was made to film 2 Lord of the Rings movies back to back, with the idea to release them about 6 months apart. But when the pitch concluded, silence fell upon the room, and Robert Shea said something along the lines of, "I don't get it. Why would it be 2 films?" The gutting was immense. The team's worst fears had come true, but he continued. "It's 3 books, isn't it? Shouldn't it be 3 movies?" All of a sudden, the room lit up. New Line Cinema had just given the green light for 3 consecutive Lord of the Rings movies. This is where it all began. This is where a trilogy of massive and sprawling books would finally be brought to live action in a big screen adventure the likes of which people had never seen before. This is where Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens, and everyone involved with the production would begin to make history, creating what many would describe as the greatest film trilogy of all time. This is where we finally begin The Lord of the Rings, a complete retrospective. If you're enjoying the video, like and subscribe. It helps out a lot. Alright, let's keep it moving. With the trilogy officially underway and the massive machine finally rolling, there was one significant question that the filmmakers had to answer. How the hell were they actually going to adapt Lord of the Rings? Thankfully, the experience of developing the story for 2 films allowed them to answer some questions about how best to translate the story. But that doesn't dispute the fact that The Lord of the Rings was still a massive story with tons of locations, cultures, as well as a massive cast of characters. A cast that spanned plenty of the races of Middle-earth, starting with the unlikely heroes, the Hobbits. You got Frodo, the one who takes on the burden of carrying the One Ring to Mordor, with his trusted friend Samwise Gamgee. And then there's Merry and Pippin, the troublemakers turned heroes. They're all joined by the wizard Gandalf, who provides a lot of intuition for the group. The dwarves are represented by Gimli. The elves are represented by Legolas. Then you have the race of men, perhaps the most significant part of the story, who are represented by Aragorn, the reluctant heir to the throne of Gondor, Boromir, and eventually his brother Faramir, all of whom were going up against the treacherous orcs and ruthless Uruk-hai, all on a quest to defeat the evil of the corrupted wizard Saruman, and of course the Dark Lord himself, Sauron, the one who forged the One Ring. It's a huge story, a huge world, and early in the process, in order to best introduce this world to mainstream audiences, Peter Jackson landed on the idea of doing a prologue in the first movie to lay everything out nice and neatly. From the defeat of Sauron to the seeming fall of men, all to track the ring to when it would wind up in the hands of Bilbo Baggins, an event also seen in the Hobbit novel. Though even with this prologue idea in mind, putting together so much information in such a short time was proving to be a headache for the writers. It's a lot to throw at the audience, a lot to establish to get this story underway. But it made one thing pretty clear for the filmmakers. They wanted these movies to move fast. They wanted to keep the energy up and keep things flowing as smoothly and as briskly as possible, even if the stories they were telling were hugely dense and quite long. But it did mean that there were fairly significant elements from the books that had to be cut, specifically during the early parts of Frodo and Sam's journey, as they make their way towards the village of Bree. Because in the books, they encounter Old Man Willow and, of course, Tom Bombadil. But since these scenes didn't really push Frodo's story along, they were cut entirely from the scripts. It's unfortunate, but it was done to keep the pace up through the movies. And with the way the scenes would ultimately be put together, there's nothing to say that Frodo and Sam didn't encounter these characters off screen, so... But where certain things were lost, other things were expanded. Specifically, the character of Arwen got a massive expansion in the scripts. Her role in the books was rather minuscule, but there was a portion of the book's Appendices that delved a whole hell of a lot deeper into her relationship with Aragorn. As such, the filmmakers saw fit to work this directly into the story of the movies, to bring this aspect to life, given how integral it is to Aragorn's character. But the most daunting aspect of adapting these stories specifically came with The Two Towers and Return of the King. Because these books, let's just say, are not conventionally structured. While Fellowship of the Ring told one single story from start to finish, The Two Towers and Return of the King were comprised of two halves that told two separate stories going on simultaneously. The first half of The Two Towers followed Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and the race of men across Rohan, Gondor, among other places, following the breaking of the Fellowship, chronicling the massive battle of Helm's Deep, and concluding with a confrontation with the corrupted wizard Saruman. And then, after all of that was wrapped up, the second half of the book turned back the clock to chronicle Frodo and Sam's journey as they inch their way closer to Mordor. From their first meeting with the creature Gollum, to their encounter with Faramir, all the way into the stairs to Cirith Ungol, and finally closing out with a massive confrontation with the demon spider Shelob. And Return of the King followed suit. The first half followed the siege of Gondor and the Battle of Pelennor Fields, while the second half saw Sam and Frodo take their last leg towards Mount Doom to destroy the ring once and for all. All of this worked well for the book. There were plenty of moments of tension that were created by not knowing what was going on the other side until you got to the second half. But for the movie, the filmmakers realized you can't just take half the runtime before reuniting with the two most important characters in the story, which meant that ultimately the two halves would be intercut. You'd spend a bit of time over here, then you'd spend a bit of time over there. Also that these events would be seen in a more accurate timeline order. But then the filmmakers ran into another issue, because this intercutting would mean that the Two Towers would end with two massive finales, the Battle of Helm's Deep on one side and Shelob's Lair on the other, both of which take a massive emotional toll, and if you put them together they'd be fighting for the viewer's attention, which would ultimately result in neither coming out victorious. Not to mention the sequence in Shelob's Lair actually takes place much later than the Battle of Helm's Deep. If you look at the timeline of events, it takes place much closer to the Siege of Gondor. So perhaps in a more drastic change, it was decided that the stairs to Cirith Ungol and the entire story in Shelob's Lair would be moved to the start of Return of the King, thus lining it up a lot more with the timeline established by the books. But this now meant that Frodo and Sam needed some kind of climactic moment for the end of the Two Towers, because as much as these movies would be one big story spanning 9 to 12 hours, each movie needed to be able to have a beginning, middle, and end. So the meeting with Faramir, as seen in the second book, was greatly expanded. Frodo and Sam would now be brought to Osgiliath, the destroyed city of Gondor. They never went here in the book, but it became necessary to take them here for the second movie's finale, which also resulted in a big expansion and drastic change in the characterization of Faramir. In the books, Faramir was noble and fair, he showed the hobbits and Gollum the utmost respect, and even refused to take the ring from Frodo under any circumstances. But to create a bit more tension and add to the dramatic force of the ring, the movie changed this significantly. In the movie, Faramir would be susceptible to the power of the ring, just like everyone else, and would want to take it back to his father Denethor to prove his quality. Until eventually, Faramir would let Frodo and Sam go. He'd ultimately let them complete their task, giving his character an arc over the second movie. An arc that would also give Sam and Frodo yet another obstacle in their immense quest to destroy the ring. But even with the sizable changes made to this story to bring it to the big screen, the filmmakers still wanted to be faithful to a lot of Tolkien's thematic ideas. They wanted to make sure that Tolkien's themes were still front and center in this adaptation, not the least of which was Tolkien's own hatred for the evolution of technology, and specifically humanity's reliance on technology. The heroes of Lord of the Rings are in tune with the world around them, while the villains are immensely destructive, tearing everything away for the cause of machinery and industrialization.
We should take what Tolkien cared about clearly, we should take those and we should put them into the film. This should ultimately be Tolkien's film, it shouldn't be ours.
But adapting these books into screenplays was only one part of this massive process. It's one thing to write it down, it's an entirely different thing to bring it to life visually. And knowing that they were going to be filming 3 movies back to back, Peter Jackson went through great pains to make sure that they worked their way through as many details as possible before a single camera began rolling. So he joined up with Christian Rivers to storyboard the entire trilogy, every single shot drawn out, which managed to give Peter Jackson a first pass at directing the movies. He was able to visualize them, find out what worked and what didn't, as well as what scenes perhaps needed to be cut. This was also helped by creating small miniature sets for him to fly a camera around, allowing him to work in these 3D environments so that the team could wrap their head around some more complicated shots and locations. On top of that, Lord of the Rings was one of the first movies to utilize computer-generated pre-visualization. They had heard about its use from Rick McCallum, who was a producer on the Star Wars prequels, which were being developed at the same time, and they were able to use pre Pre-Vis to take their ideas even further and go even crazier in some shots and really figure out in a 3D environment how it was all going to work out. Not only was this immensely helpful for shot choices, editing choices, but it also worked as a guide for the work that would be done by Weta Workshop. Still headed by Richard Taylor and Tanya Roger, Weta Workshop continued the work they had already done for the 2-film version from Miramax. They were given the directive that while this was a fantasy story, they shouldn't treat it like a fantasy film. Tolkien intended for the stories of Middle-earth to have taken place in ancient Europe 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. This wasn't fantasy, it was history. It needed to feel like they were bringing real things back from the past, and filming them on camera as close as they originally appeared. It was an immense amount of work, and while plenty had already been done for the 2-film version, there was plenty more to come as the clock eventually turned to the year 1999. Across the entire production, Weta Workshop was in charge of armor, weapons, prosthetics and makeup, creatures, and miniatures. Why so much? Well, it's to maintain a level of consistency so that everything was done in-house and all had the same look and feel and same amount of quality. Weta Workshop employed tons of New Zealand craftspeople to bring tons and tons of props to life. There were thousands of orc and urukai prosthetics, hundreds of hobbit feet for the 4 main characters alone, and there were tons and tons of swords, which were all masterminded by Peter Lyon, the swordsmith who brought the most iconic weapons to life, including Narsil, the sword of the King of Gondor. John Howe, who was still working as a concept designer for the movie, also had a hand in the armor. He had tons of experience in medieval reenactments and plenty of sets of armor himself, meaning he was able to bring that expertise to the armor department to give each set a sense of authenticity. But the armor wasn't all, as tons and tons of characters were also set to wear chainmail under their armor. But as John Howe would later admit, most film attempts at chainmail often looked bad. And if there's one thing Lord of the Rings didn't want to be, it was bad. So instead, it was discovered that if you took a piece of pneumatic pipe and cut it into small rings, you could then painstakingly link the rings together to form these chainmail suits. It was said that Gimli's chainmail alone used 80,000 of these little loops. 2 guys working all alone spent their entire days putting all of these loops together to form lightweight and good-looking sets of chainmail. It got so far that they completely rubbed off the fingerprints on some of their fingers, and yet they couldn't be happier.
I would not have traded this experience for the world. It has been the most amazing time of my life.
But perhaps the most impressive aspect of this design was the fact that each race of Middle-earth was given a distinct look. Lord of the Rings is a multicultural story, and each culture needed to look different. The armor was one aspect that personified this. There's an elegance to the elven armor and a gruff, rough-and-tumble attitude to the dwarves. Then there was even thought put into how the armor evolved, as Gondorian and elven armor would not only be seen in the present story during the Third Age, but also in flashbacks to the Second Age, 3,000 years earlier, so it needed to look a bit different. This level of detail was also felt in the costuming side of things, which was headed by costume designer Nyla Dixon. Once again, each race and each character was given a distinct look and feel that made everything feel lived in and like it had evolved from this long and dense history. Not only that, but the fact that all of these design groups were communicating with each other and working under the same roof meant that there was a lot of consistency. You know, elven weapons would match the elven armor, would match the elven costumes, and that was true of every single race. While the immense details of Tolkien's world would be impossible to depict fully in the screenplay, the details done by the costumes, armor, and props went a long way to help communicate that depth and vividness visually. That's without even mentioning perhaps the most important prop in the entire trilogy, the One Ring itself. There were plenty of ideas, suggestions, and designs made for the One Ring, but nothing seemed to really land. That was until one of the many rehearsal shoots that Peter Jackson did with some of the producers, including co-producer Rick Porras. During this rehearsal period, he used his own wedding ring as a prop for the ring, and perhaps in a biased way came to the conclusion that it served as a really good basis for the real ring prop. And of course, it was, ultimately leading way to the simple, gold, elegant shape that the crew eventually landed on. They even made a supersized version for some of the extreme close-ups. The design of the entire world also went a long way to show the distinct qualities, as John Howe and Alan Lee worked tirelessly to give each location its own look. The lands of Rivendell and Lothlorien were both elven lands, so they were one with nature, built among the trees, surrounding them yet not overtaking them. But they were also two different groups of elves, so they each had to look distinct. Lothlorien was far more closed off, hidden amidst the forest, while Rivendell was way more open, showing off its luster across the entire area. The dwarves were very geometric. There were no circles, no rounded edges. Everything was squared off, hard angles. This was evidenced most clearly in the mines of Moria and the massive pillars of Dwaradelf. Then the race of men were embodied by structures that were very reminiscent of Old England. But like the elves, there were also several different groups of men. There was the realm of Rohan, which featured lots and lots of horse motifs both in the building designs as well as in the engravings on swords and armor. Then Gondor featured a lot more symbolism from the White Tree and the motif of wings on the Gondorian helmets. Not only that, but Rohan's forces were far more spread out over a huge swath of land, meaning the armor for each person was a little unique. Each soldier had customized themselves to a certain degree. But Gondor was far more localized to the city of Minas Tirith, so their armor was completely uniform and far more ceremonial instead of being entirely practical. Also that these two groups of people, while still the same race, could look entirely different and carry their own culture and history. But above all of this, there was a specific aspect of Weta Workshop's work on Lord of the Rings that Peter Jackson loved above all others. Miniatures. Smaller scale versions of each of these breathtaking locations that could be used as backdrops, establishing shots, any number of things to really bring these otherworldly places to life. Although, in order to get the amount of detail that the team wanted from these miniatures, they wound up being pretty big. Sure, each miniature is still smaller than the real thing, but a lot of them could also fill an entire soundstage. I mean, there was a miniature for Fangorn Forest that you could walk through. It was that big. Hence, the term bigatures was coined, as the crew were constantly impressed with the immense scale and detail for every single one of these models. In fact, during one of the attempts to bring the Dark Tower Barad-dûr to life, it wound up standing 27 feet tall. It couldn't even fit in their construction building, it was so big. Like, that's crazy. But even with the use of miniatures and visual effects, plenty of the movie was still going to be shot on location. In fact, the movie was going to film entirely in New Zealand, mainly because Peter Jackson felt that New Zealand embodied an untainted version of Europe, which Tolkien had based his entire world on. In a sense, New Zealand was Middle-earth. While plenty of production was going to take place in and around Wellington, in sound stages and backlots and the like, the production was also going to make use of New Zealand's many breathtaking locations. One of which was this lush farmland with rolling hills just outside the Waikato town of Matamata. This was the site of the Shire. It seemed to match the description Tolkien had written perfectly, and Alan Lee and John Howe immediately got to work envisioning all of the hobbit holes that had popped out across the landscape. In the middle of the South Island sits Mount Sunday, a small rocky hill jutting out from the ground just before an impressive mountain range. The perfect location for Edoras, the main city of Rohan. All across New Zealand's breathtaking locations were tons and tons of places that matched perfectly with what Tolkien described, and they would ultimately make for some of the production's most visually stunning moments. But even with all of these pieces being put into place, there was still an incredibly integral step in the process that would either make or break the entire trilogy, and that was casting. With a story this size, you're dealing with a lot of characters, a lot of actors. It's a big ensemble story with a lot of moving parts. So the filmmakers had a momentous task ahead of them to find the right people and find a lot of them to take on these roles. Then there's also the requirement that a lot of these people would have to take nearly a year and a half out of their lives to journey to New Zealand to film the whole trilogy. So, no pressure. Right off the bat, there were some names that Peter Jackson came up with pretty much immediately. It was a no-brainer for the team to get Ian Holm on board as Bilbo Baggins and Ian McKellen on board as Gandalf. Although getting Ian McKellen wasn't as easy as it initially looked, because as much as he was interested, his schedule was jam-packed by the upcoming X-Men film and Mission Impossible 2. But seemingly by happenstance, the MI2 production kept getting delayed, and as such, Ian McKellen dropped out to instead take on Gandalf, once his commitments to X-Men had run their course. But the most daunting character to cast was, of course, Frodo. Essentially the main character of the story, the entire trilogy hinges on him, and the team got set right away looking for the perfect young actor to play Frodo. And because the filmmakers came to the decision that the hobbits would all be Englished as Tolkien had written them, they auditioned nearly 300 English actors in London to see if they could find their Frodo. But with each one that came by, they knew it ultimately wouldn't work out. But one day, fortune changed a little bit, because the casting team suddenly received a VHS tape from Los Angeles, an audition tape from none other than Elijah Wood. Somehow, Elijah Wood had heard about this project and these auditions and knew the team wouldn't be going out to Los Angeles. So he hired a dialect coach to hone in his English accent and filmed an audition tape himself to send to the team. And upon seeing it, Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and the entire casting team knew right then and there that they had found their Frodo. From here, the rest of the cast began to fit into place. Sean Astin joined as Samwise Gamgee, the character Tolkien himself considered the hero of the story. Dominic Monaghan and Billy Boyd joined as the troublesome hobbit duo Merry and Pippin. Orlando Bloom joined as Legolas. In fact, this was Orlando Bloom's first feature film. What a way to get started. Timothy Spall was originally slated to play Gimli, but that ultimately fell through, with the part eventually landing in the hands of John Rhys Davies. The role of Boromir eventually came to Sean Bean, and when it came to Saruman the White, the casting of Christopher Lee was a masterstroke. Christopher Lee was a huge fan of the books. In fact, reading the entire trilogy became a yearly tradition of his ever since the books came out. It was a dream of his to one day be involved in the inevitable live-action adaptation, and now the dream had come true. Not only that, but he is the only person on the cast and crew who actually met J.R.R. Tolkien, which is pretty neat. Then, finally, one of the most pivotal roles in the trilogy, Aragorn, had found its actor, Stuart Townsend. While there were some apprehensive fans online, others were hopeful that all would eventually work out in the end. And eventually, Liv Tyler joined the cast as Arwen, who fans already knew was going to have a far grander role than what was in the books. But even with the cast starting to be filled out, there was one character who proved to be one of the most daunting aspects of the entire production, and that was Gollum. Gollum is perhaps one of, if not the most important character to the entire story. He's directly tied to the ring, it has bent and twisted him over centuries, and throughout the story he winds up being a not-so-trustworthy avenue to get Frodo and Sam into Mordor. But by the very nature of how Gollum would be the sickly, skinny, almost half-dead kind of character, you couldn't get a real person to play him. There was just no way the filmmakers could ask this of someone, or find someone who matched that physique. So instead, the decision was made early on that Gollum would be an entirely CGI character. Something like this, a character with this much presence being made entirely in the computer, it was kind of unprecedented. The Weta Digital team only had the work done by ILM for the Phantom Menace to go off of. In fact, there was a real lack of confidence from New Line. They didn't think they could do it. But despite that, the team got to work, designing a character that encapsulated Gollum to the nth degree, creating a physical model at the Weta Workshop that would be translated to a computer model for Weta Digital to animate in whatever way they wanted. But even then, there was still a long way to go. It was a massive task, but one that Weta Workshop and Weta Digital took on with full force, because more than anything else, Gollum was the one thing they couldn't get wrong.
If Gollum wasn't believable, if he fundamentally didn't work, then you were going to kill not just the Two Towers, but the Return of the King.
But now, after years of pre-production and planning, after years of casting and set design, everything had finally come to the point where they were ready to begin rolling cameras. Everything had finally led to October 11th, 1999, where all of the actors finally made their way to New Zealand to begin the massive 15-month principal shoot for The Lord of the Rings.
This is the biggest low-budget film being made anywhere in the world at this time.
Filming began just outside of Wellington, in a location that would make perfect use for the wooded road. The four hobbits together at the start of the story would come across a black rider, a ringwraith. A perfect first day to center on some of the most pivotal characters, as well as begin to hint at the danger they were all going to face. But it wasn't just the characters that were facing troubles, because right as production started, there was one major change that could throw everything for a loop. Because before the production was set to film its first scenes with Aragorn, Peter Jackson and company had come to realize that the actor that they had cast, Stuart Townsend, was too young. They realized that while they had a great actor, he he wasn't right for Aragorn. So, not even a month into production, Stuart Townsend was let go, and the production worked fast to find someone to fill the shoes so they could still make their planned schedule. As such, calls were immediately made to get none other than Viggo Mortensen to take on the role. The stakes were made clear. There wasn't a lot of time for him to decide, and if he said yes, he'd also be taking part in the 15-month shoot down in New Zealand. On top of that, Viggo Mortensen had never read the books, but his son was a huge fan of the books. He'd read them backwards and forwards, and upon hearing that his father might play Aragorn in the movie, well, it became a no-brainer. Viggo Mortensen said yes and was immediately on a plane to New Zealand. Just in time, as he had mere days for a crash course on sword fighting, all before filming his first scene on Weathertop, facing down the Ringwraiths. The machine was now officially rolling, and boy was it a big machine. Due to the absolutely massive scope of production, Peter Jackson couldn't hope to film every single scene on his own. So the production made use of second units. Yes, I said units plural, because you see, throughout this production, it was possible that there could be 5 units filming 5 scenes simultaneously. While Peter Jackson would be the guiding hand and the unifying voice to make sure it all felt like it was the same movie, each second unit would have its own director to bring that footage to fruition. The second units were directed by John Mahaffey, Jeff Murphy, with additional units on top of that being directed by Ian Mune, Guy Norris, Barry Osborne, Rick Porras, and Fran Walsh. Each with their own crews, their own cinematographers, all to capture the immense amount of footage the production demanded. But even though they were all working separately, there was still a real-time satellite uplink that allowed the units to transmit footage to Peter Jackson and get his input on what they were doing.
I just remembered we've got Peter with us today, so we don't have to send it anywhere. That would be stupid.
There was also daily collaboration with Weta Workshop, who took on the duties of applying and maintaining the prosthetics and props that they had created during pre-production. Prosthetics extended not just from the orcs and Uruk-hai, but even the principal hero characters. The 4 hobbits had a significantly longer day than a lot of the other actors, as they had to come in a few hours early to get their hobbit feet glued on, their ears placed, their wigs set, all before getting their costumes and rushing onto set. But perhaps the person with the most prosthetics was John Rhys Davies as Gimli. He had nearly an entire face of prosthetics with a full beard and wig. Not to mention the fact that John Rhys Davies was actually allergic to the prosthetics, which made his eyes swell up any time he was wearing them, which was every day. Couple that with the fact that he's often wearing this big helmet and he could barely see. Despite that, he came to work with a smile and always made a point to show the Weta guys the full costume when it was complete, to show them right up front the character that they had created and the results of all their hard work. All the while, every day that passed, the scripts were still being worked on and rewritten, as Peter Jackson was continuing to work with all of the actors to get their input to bring out the best stories possible. Because of this daily collaboration, the scripts turned from one thing into a whole other thing that evolved directly from everyone's participation and effort. But even during production, things hit a snag, as during the filming for Fellowship, massive floods suddenly hit the city of Queenstown, completely squashing the crew's plans for the day. But they still needed to do something in order to not waste valuable time, so they jumped ahead a little bit and built a set for the stairs to Cirith Ungol, a scene that wouldn't appear until the 3rd movie, Return of the King. It was daunting for Elijah Wood and Sean Astin, as they were suddenly thrust into this scene so much farther down the road than they had been. Not to mention that this was the first time that the crew filmed a scene with Gollum, which was especially tricky because they hadn't cast Gollum yet. But they did have a stand-in in his place to give the animators something to work off of, and it became the first big test with real footage to see how Gollum would really look, a kind of proof of concept that this really could be done. And throughout the day, all of Sean Astin's shots were filmed, his side of the conversation, with the intent that the next day they'd film Elijah Wood's side. But instead, the skies cleared, the locations dried out, and the next day the production resumed filming for Fellowship of the Ring. Because of that, the stair set simply remained as a standby in the case of a rainy day. Of course, a rainy day wouldn't come for a while, so the set kind of stayed there in the middle of the squash court, taking over the room for quite a bit longer than planned. In any event, production continued to truck along, soon approaching the turn of the millennium as the crew continued filming into the year 2000. After Christmas break came and went and the crews were back on January 17th of the new year, the cast was finally joined by Ian McKellen, who'd finally completed his work on the X-Men film. As such, plenty of scenes were filmed in Hobbiton with both Ian McKellen and Ian Holm. But this also brought along one of the most challenging and perhaps most exciting aspects of making these movies. That aspect being that you had several different groups of characters who were all different sizes. Hobbits and dwarves are much smaller than men, elves, and wizards, but the actors who portrayed them were decidedly not that small. In fact, John Rhys Davies is 6 feet tall, which actually wound up being a blessing in disguise because that meant he was perfectly scaled for the hobbits, so they could be photographed together and Gimli would be a tiny bit bigger, which was accurate to what Tolkien had described. But they still had to figure something out for everyone else. Throughout the entire pre-production process, Peter Jackson and director of photography Andrew Lesnie posed this incredibly important question for themselves. How are they going to convincingly make these characters their accurate sizes? Turns out they had a lot of solutions. One of the simpler ones was the use of scale doubles. Children and smaller people were used for the hobbits, while people who were 7 feet tall were used for Gandalf and Aragorn, among others. Also, for the hobbit scale doubles, rubber masks were used to make them look like the actors they were portraying, as there were plenty of occasions where their faces would be seen on camera, if only from a distance. They had to match the mannerisms, stances, every part of the larger actor's body in order to convincingly make it seem that they were all the same person. At the same time, massive animatronic suits were used during the filming at Bree, also that massive people could walk by the hobbits to make them seem so much smaller than they really were. Although that process was shortly abandoned because it was a little wee bit expensive. Sometimes green screen effects were used, sometimes the actors would be on their knees to take a foot or two off of their height, but there was one trick that was definitely the most interesting one of the bunch, because there were times that the camera movement would negate the use of green screens, and conversation scenes would negate the use of scale doubles, as audiences would see right through the rubber masks. In these scenarios, the production utilized a trick known as forced perspective. It's pretty simple in concept. You got two actors on the set, and you move one of them further away from the camera. Then, with the camera in just the right spot, they just look like they're a smaller person standing next to a bigger person. It's a trick used in photography all the time, but the extra challenge came when suddenly the camera started moving. Once the camera moves, you reveal the effect. You reveal the distance between the two people. So, rigs were made to move the sets in sync with the movements of the camera. Then, to help sell it, props were made at the two different sizes, bringing the entire shot together. While this trick only appeared in a sparing few shots, it wound up being some of the most impressive effects work on the entire production. And it was especially thrilling for the crew, who could see their work right then and there on camera. Hobbits were suddenly real, and they were the right size. Oh, also the entire house of Bag End had to be made twice. One large-scale house for the hobbits, and a small-scale one for Ian McKellen to seem like a giant in. And everything inside was duplicated at the two different scales. I mean, it's crazy.
What I love is that we employed every trick from like absolute latest state-of-the-art digital technology to, rubber bands, chewing gum, like whatever you could drag out of a hat, all these old sleight of hands.
It's incredible the amount of work that went into this specific aspect, but it went a long way to bring all of this imagery to life in a way that had never been done before. But the longer the shoot went on, fans on the outside were growing antsy. The production in New Zealand was top secret. They were keeping a tight lid on as much as they could, so fans could only get their eyes on so much. But during the course of production, word started to come through that the first footage would soon be revealed online. Helped in part by LordOfTheRings.net as well as TheOneRing.net, the production finally unveiled the first official look at the trilogy on April 7th, 2000.
It has been named the greatest and most popular book of the 20th century.
The responsibility of bringing this world to the screen visually is obviously enormous.
Across 90 seconds, this teaser featured plenty of behind-the-scenes imagery, the first looks at the hobbits, orcs, Uruk-hai, as well as some early VFX work done by Weta Digital, all before exploding into a montage of footage across all three films, of massive armies, ring wraiths, battles. While a concrete story could not be told, the imagery and visuals present got plenty of fans excited. It looked like the world of Tolkien was being ripped up from the page and plastered all over the screen. The Lord of the Rings was on its way. It was real, it was happening, and audiences were more excited than ever, especially when the teaser ended with the release date announcements for all 3 films. Excitement about this exploded over the internet as this became the most downloaded teaser to date, surpassing the already massive trailers for Star Wars Episode 1. Too bad we still have another 1.5 years to go before the first movie even hits theaters. Man, I do not know if I can wait that long. Though I'm sure the crew working on the movies can wait, as they still had months of work ahead of them as the production was still ongoing throughout the spring of 2000. The cast continued to expand with the likes of David Wenham, Bernard Hill, Carl Urban, Miranda Otto, Brad Dourif, John Noble, and eventually, perhaps one of the most significant characters was finally cast. Because on April 13th, 2000, Peter Jackson had found the voice of Gollum, none other than Andy Serkis. And yes, it was originally set to just be a voice role, and Andy Serkis had created a fantastic voice, based in large part off of his cat, specifically the coughing sound and coughing motion it would make when it was puking up a hairball, which ultimately formed the basis for Gollum's own signature cough. But the more Peter Jackson saw of Andy Serkis' work as Gollum, he saw how much physicality he was bringing to it. Andy Serkis wasn't just doing a voice, his whole body, his face was becoming part of the performance. So what started as a simple voice gig quickly evolved into something much bigger, as Andy Serkis was suddenly on set every day to film scenes with Elijah Wood and Sean Astin. While at first the dynamic was a little weird, some of the actors didn't really know or understand exactly what he was doing, but in time, despite the ridiculous outfit he was wearing every day, Andy Serkis became a major part of the team. Not to mention his physicality allowed him to crawl around, he threw himself all over the set, putting everything that he possibly could into the performance to fully embody Gollum at every step of the way.
Because he was coming into a situation where none of us really thought we needed Andy, other than his voice. I mean, but we gradually came to realize we couldn't do without him.
On top of that, for a flashback sequence where we see Smeagol first get corrupted by the ring, Peter Jackson cast Andy Serkis, so we wound up really embodying the character throughout the entire journey. All the while, the production continued to journey around New Zealand, filming in plenty of incredible sets and breathtaking locations, sometimes for really quick bouts of time, others for a bit longer. The Council of Elrond was a scene that took nearly 5 days to film, mainly because there was so much coverage and they needed to get angles of every character. But as long and arduous as that might have seemed, it was nothing compared to the 3 months of night shoots to film the massive Battle of Helm's Deep. Across several sets, several miniatures of varying sizes, this massive sequence was put together with tons and tons of extras to make up the armies of Uruk-hai, men, and elves. Then, of course, you had the principal characters, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Theoden, among others, as well as Arwen, played by Liv Tyler. In a change from the books, the filmmakers originally had the idea to bring this character to the Battle of Helm's Deep to help tie her and Aragorn's story together. Liv Tyler went through all of the sword training and preemptive work, and even took part in some of the shooting early on. But ultimately, having her as part of the battle didn't wind up sitting right with Peter Jackson, Philippa Boyens, and Fran Walsh. So instead, they found another way of incorporating her into the story to keep her close with Aragorn despite them being miles and miles apart. The crew took a journey down to Mount Sunday once the massive set for Edoras was complete, a set that was widely regarded as perhaps one of the crowning achievements of the entire shoot. Actors would go on record to say that it felt like they were really there. It's only a shame that it was never allowed to stay, but the crew proved themselves in another way by clearing out all of their equipment and buildings once they were done, making it look like they were never even there. That level of detail and scale was also felt in the Gondorian sets, specifically the city of Osgiliath, which once the extras were in place, the whole thing just came to life. And of course, there was the biggest set of the entire production, Minas Tirith, the White City, the crowning achievement of Gondor. The Minas Tirith set was actually built in the same location as the Helm's Deep set, and even reused some of those pieces. But once it was all put together, even the people who worked on it could barely tell what was reused and what wasn't. It all looked so incredible. This massive Minas Tirith set had tons of little areas and little pieces, all of which could be used for any number of parts of the city. From small shops, to walkways, to back alleys, to the main entranceway, it it was all there, and it was all built with incredible detail. At the same time, more talent began to be hired behind the scenes. Most specifically, in August of 2000, the trilogy gained one of its most important voices, none other than Howard Shore, who was set to take on the musical score for the entire trilogy. Work began right away for music that would encompass all three movies. While it might not have fit the conventional understanding, Howard Shore intended the entire score to play like an opera. Each film would be an act. After one film concluded, the curtains would come down, you'd be able to take a little break, all before going back to see the curtains rise once again on the next movie. And ultimately, once all three films were complete and you'd listen to the music all the way through, it would be one big musical performance. As much as each movie would have a bit of a distinct sound and new themes to carry it through, it was all going to live under one massive umbrella. Now, I know what you're thinking. What about that one set on the stairs to Cirith Ungol? Are they still holding up that squash court? Well, yes, they were. But eventually, when production finally came to the bulk of Return of the King shooting, the crew finally returned to that set in November of 2000. An entire year after they filmed Sean Astin's half, they were finally back to film Elijah Wood's half. It's a really weird scenario where you have two sides of a conversation filmed an entire year apart. Not only that, but this time Andy Serkis was there, being able to really bring Gollum to the scene. It took him an entire year to finish filming one scene, and yet they were all confident it would ultimately cut together seamlessly. Production continued to hold strong throughout the remaining months of the year, with the planned wrap set just before Christmas break. But with such a hard date in place, the closer they got to the end, the more hectic things became. As they were winding down on principal photography for Return of the King, things began moving faster and faster, all before reaching a fever pitch in the final week of production in December of 2000. In the last 7 days, there were no less than 7 units filming at any given moment, working 24/7 around the clock. There was always at least one camera rolling to get these movies done. Peter Jackson was constantly jumping from one set to another. Actors were going through multiple costume changes. Some of them even jumped between all 3 movies in the span of one day. But as a side effect of working so fast and at so many places at once, some of these scenes might have been a little rushed. Certain climactic moments were done in the blink of an eye because they just had to move on to the next thing. While perhaps not the most satisfying conclusion, production did finally come to a close. For the first time in film history, 3 films had been shot at the same time. Starting on October 11th, 1999 and concluding on December 22nd, 2000, the 15-month production had finally drawn to a close. It was an accomplishment that left the entire crew on cloud 9. New Zealand had become the home of Middle-earth, with plenty of craftspeople, stuntmen, extras, and horse riders, some of whom were even women with beards simply because of how many people the production demanded. The New Zealand Army even took part, providing many troops as extras for the final battle outside of the Black Gates of Mordor. There were all sorts of people from across the country brought in for what would be the biggest production ever seen in New Zealand. Not only that, but it was one of the biggest productions of all time. No one had ever attempted something of this scale, and yet this crew, this team had pulled through and done what others felt was seemingly impossible. They had filmed The Lord of the Rings. Celebrations were had, people finally got to go home for Christmas, and the fellowship that had been established finally parted ways.
Nobody's ever shot 3 huge movies in a row before, and I think the most interesting thing I've discovered over the last 14 months is exactly why nobody's ever done that. Now I know, and therefore I won't be doing it again.
But even still, there was plenty of work that still had to be done. It wasn't long after the completion of principal photography that the production really started to get the word out on Lord of the Rings. While there was an initial trailer back in April, the time had come for something a bit bigger, because on January 12, 2001, New Line released an all-new trailer, once again on LordOfTheRings.net and TheOneRing.net. New Line knew that the internet was a huge powerhouse for marketing, and the production continued its solid relationship with the latest teaser for the highly anticipated trilogy.
One ring to rule them all. One ring to find them. One ring to bring them all. And in the darkness, bind them.
Across another 90 seconds, this teaser doesn't show much, but it hints at some of the incredible imagery, some story ideas, and overall just gets across this feeling that this trilogy will be unlike anything anyone has ever seen. All before ultimately concluding with a shot of the entire Fellowship, coupled with the release dates for all 3 movies. We got one coming every year, and this Christmas, things were gonna begin with the first chapter, The Fellowship of the Ring. Though as Peter Jackson really began diving into post-production on the trilogy, he originally thought he'd be able to work on all 3 simultaneously, and that he'd be able to work with one editor across all 3 movies. Though that quickly became an impossibility. There was just too much to work on and not enough time. So instead, the post-production on Fellowship became the top priority, with this first movie to be edited by John Gilbert. Work was immediately underway to take the incomprehensible amount of footage and bring it all together for the first of these 3 adventures, with the second and third slowly working through their footage at the same time. One of the most difficult parts of the edit was the prologue. While the idea of the prologue had been established very early on, the filmmakers kept waffling on how to include it. There were some cuts that didn't feature a prologue at all, and other cuts that featured that information at the midpoint, when Elrond explains his history to Gandalf. But neither of these wound up working. No matter what else they tried, the backstory needed to be right up front, and once they hunkered down, Peter Jackson and John Gilbert finally put it together in a way that worked, and in a way that got all the information across to kick this story off with a bang. All the while, promotion for the first movie was starting to heat up, as fans were getting more antsy as each month passed, until eventually, in May of 2001, Peter Jackson and company revealed nearly 20 minutes of footage to the Cannes Film Festival. Press was heard round and round about how incredible this footage was, and fans hoped that they'd finally get a glimpse of it for themselves. Thankfully, they didn't have to wait much longer, as eventually, on May 25th, 2001, playing before Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor in theaters, audiences got their first theatrical look at The Fellowship of the Ring.
Legend tells of a ring created by an ancient evil that gave its wearer the power to enslave the world. Believed lost for centuries, it has now been found.
Is it secret? Is it safe?
Across 2.5 minutes, this trailer has one goal in mind: get everyone on board. It needed to get die-hard Tolkien fans on board, showing them some of the most iconic scenes and imagery from the books, but it also needed to get the layman on board. People who had never read the books, people who perhaps had never even heard the name Frodo Baggins. They needed to be sold on this fantastical adventure across an entire other world. The idea of the ring is established, some of the characters are set up, the evil Dark Lord Sauron is made out to be this incredible threat to this entire mission, all the while the trailer features a little tease of Gollum.
There's something down there. Precious.
And finally, the trailer establishes the subtitle of the movie. This group of disparate characters coming together to form the Fellowship of the Ring, all before exploding into a massive montage of action and incredible imagery. Audiences were excited. Lord of the Rings was now one of the most hotly anticipated movies of the year, and despite its unconventional Christmas release, this first entry was already the talk of the town, as people were gearing up for this trip into an entire other world. But the filmmakers behind the scenes still had a hell of a road ahead of them, because during the editing process with Peter Jackson and John Gilbert, they realized something that they had kind of already expected. They needed more footage. I know, it sounds crazy, but in order to really smooth over certain parts of the edit, cut down certain scenes, or just get a piece of information across a bit more clearly, the entire cast and crew was brought back to New Zealand for a few weeks of pickup shoots in the summer of 2001. It was exciting for pretty much everyone, as they were all back together for yet another stint in New Zealand, all able to see each other again after principal photography concluded back in December. Though there was the daunting prospect of somehow matching the footage that was was shot during principal photography. Would the performances match? Would the sets match? Surprisingly, they did, which is doubly impressive considering most of the pickups were not done back on set. They were done in the parking lot just outside of the studio in Wellington, and yet when paired with the footage they already had, the transition was seamless. And with this new footage captured and the edit slowly progressing, work was going on simultaneously at Weta Digital, who are beginning to pioneer certain technology to bring the world of Tolkien to life. For Fellowship of the Ring, Weta Digital had a sum total of about 500 visual effects shots, including compositing for scale shots, compositing for all of the miniatures that were used for the backgrounds. Not only that, but Weta Digital was also tasked with creating some entirely CGI characters for some pivotal sequences. Specifically, they created the Watcher in the Water, this massive tentacled creature who attacked the Fellowship, and the Cave Troll, both of which were physically modeled by Weta Workshop and then scanned into the computer to be animated into these scenes. Weta Digital was building off the ground established by the rapid evolution of visual effects during the 90s, and they were also pushing things forward and breaking new ground in the process. They utilized motion capture at times, and even utilized technology to allow Peter Jackson to man a camera within a digital environment, all of which helped to really speed things along. On top of that, they also had a software called Massive, which was able to create entire swaths of armies in CG, all to sell the absolutely massive scale that Peter Jackson was going for. And this visual effects work would soon be glimpsed by audiences only a few short months out from the film's release. Because on September 21st, 2001, New Line released yet another trailer for Fellowship of the Ring to really build up anticipation in the fall months. Lord of the Rings was their top dog. It was the must-see movie to cap off the year, and this trailer proved it. Across a whopping 3 minutes, this trailer once again continues to lay out this massive story, getting as many people on board as possible, establishing Sauron, his powerful ring, and Frodo's daring quest to destroy it. All the while, once again, bringing together the entire Fellowship to fight by his side.
You have my sword.
And you have my bow.
And my axe.
This task was appointed to you, and if you do not find a way, no one will.
The imagery was astounding, the action looked incredible, the visual effects by Weta Digital, while only shown in glimpses, was already mind-blowing, and the trailer capped off with a tease to what would be perhaps the movie's biggest sequence, a sequence that would feature one of Tolkien's greatest creations, the Balrog. The world of Tolkien looked like it had really been brought to life, and fans were more excited than ever to make the jump to theaters. And across the last months of the year, the post-production rolled closer and closer to release. On one side, Howard Shore worked tirelessly to create the musical sound from Middle-earth, creating tons and tons of themes for this first entry. Every location got a specific theme. Even locations like Rivendell and Lothlorien, which were both elven lands, were given a different sound to match the differences in each location's design. Moria got its own themes, as did Isengard, fully embodying Saruman's turn to madness, as well as Isengard's own turn into industrialization. The villainous themes also extended to the Ringwraiths, who were embodied by these rhythmic chants that were based on a poem written by Philippa Boyens, one of the screenwriters. But that wasn't all. The English poem was translated by David Salo into Adunaic, the ancient language of man, all to give it this guttural feeling of pure evil. But the most significant themes definitely came for the title characters, the Fellowship themselves, which fully personified the heroism of this group and their perilous quest. And then, of course, all of these incredible themes were joined by one more, the theme for the Shire, perhaps one of the greatest pieces of film score ever written. A small, light-hearted theme that encompassed all of the greatest aspects of a hobbit's life, and would work wonders as a theme both for the calm before the storm, but also a theme for hope where there otherwise wasn't any. And on top of that, the music team worked with Enya to create an original song that would play during the end credits, eventually titled May It Be. The music team created tons and tons of great cues for Fellowship, as well as laying the groundwork for themes that would be much larger players in The Two Towers and Return of the King. On the other side of the coin was the sound team, who also worked tirelessly to create a unique soundscape for every aspect of this first installment. Not just for the incredible battles and massive clashes of swords and shields, but to some of the creatures that were designed purely for this world. Not only that, but there was also plenty of thought put into the sounds of the ring itself, to fully make it seem like it was a character on its own. Eventually, Alan Howard came in to record plenty of lines, all spoken in black speech, the language of Mordor, to give it this unambiguous feel of absolute evil. Post-production continued right up to the wire, as all departments, editing, music, and sound worked tirelessly to finally bring the film to fruition. And ultimately, with every aspect finally locked right at the tail end of the year, the film reels were finally delivered. Now they could be multiplied and distributed worldwide. Fellowship of the Ring was done. The team had completed the first chapter of this massive story, which meant it was now time to celebrate and share it with the entire world. The first premiere was held in London on December 10th, the first time the film was ever screened for an audience, all before exploding across several premieres all around the world. The filmmakers were finally able to bring this massive adventure to tons of countries and tons of fans, including, on December 18th, a premiere in Wellington, New Zealand, bringing Middle-earth back home. The Embassy Theatre was even dressed with a massive statue of the cave troll created by Weta Workshop to really bring the whole thing together. On top of that, on the day of the premiere, the name of the city of Wellington was actually changed. For the entire day, the city was called Middle-earth. It was a huge moment of pride for New Zealand, as this massive blockbuster production, filmed and made entirely in New Zealand, was now just about to be seen by the entire world.
Thank you for coming, everybody. Thank you so much. This is the proudest moment to have Wellington turn out and be part of this. Thank you.
But even with this palpable excitement, insiders and experts knew just how daunting this gamble was from New Line. New Line was betting that not one, not two, but 3 films would ultimately work out. They had poured tons of money into all 3 of these movies, but the fate of the entire trilogy rested on the shoulders of this first outing. If Fellowship failed, the rest of the trilogy and even the studio was going down with it. While excitement was reaching a fever pitch throughout the Christmas season, everyone behind the scenes grasped onto their seats, hoping and praying that this didn't become their worst nightmares. And eventually, all led to December 19th, 2001. Finally, after 6 years of development, after years of pre-production, after the biggest concurrent production ever put to film, Fellowship of the Ring had now arrived. It was now time, after plenty of failed attempts, for audiences to really jump on over to theaters, to really step foot into Middle-earth. This movie hits the ground running with one goal in mind: get everyone in the audience on board with Middle-earth and give them all the information they need to become invested in the story they're about to see. Across 5 minutes, the prologue of this movie establishes that Middle-earth is a world inhabited by multiple different races, each with a set of powerful rings. But each of those rings would be bent to the will of Sauron, the creator of the one ring to rule them all. Sauron's evil would rush across Middle-earth, sparking the good people to fight back. In one last alliance, the elves and men fought against the evil of Mordor, and thanks to Isildur, Sauron was defeated by the broken sword of Narsil. But while Sauron fell, the ring survived, carried by Isildur until his death, and 2,500 years later, it fell into the hands of Gollum, who kept it himself for 500 more years, until it fell into the hands of the most unlikely of people, Bilbo Baggins. Everything you need to know is in this prologue, everything that an audience member needs to understand the story going forward, especially if they've never once read the books or heard these stories. It's all here. And with this backstory established and everyone on the same page, the adventure begins. Which only leaves us with the $300 million question. After all of the work that was put into these movies, after the years of development and production, is the movie any good? Well, Fellowship of the Ring is one of the greatest fantasy films of all time, and within moments it immediately sucks you into Middle-earth, thanks in part to the design of the world, the music. I mean, the moment that Shire theme plays as we're introduced to Hobbiton, you immediately fall in love with the place. All of the extensive work done throughout the entire process completely pays off here. Hobbits are small, wizards are big, and it's seamless. You don't even think about it. I mean, look at this bit. Bilbo just takes the staff and hat from Gandalf, who's like twice his size. Like, how? What? The production design, special effects, miniatures, visual effects, all of them work wonders to bring this world to life in a way that had never been seen before. And it all works seamlessly. There's hardly a crack across the entire movie. Except for this one bit. But that's really it. But what really gets audiences into this world is the characters. Each and every character feels fully realized, and audiences would immediately grow a connection after even a single line of dialogue.
A wizard is never late, Frodo Baggins. Nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to.
Within moments of meeting these characters, you're all in to take this massive journey with them. And boy, is it a big journey, as this movie sits at a whopping 3-hour runtime. And yet, because of the pace and momentum the movie keeps throughout the whole thing, those 3 hours go by in a flash. This movie is moving at a clip, telling the first chapter of this story in the most exciting way it can. The story for this first chapter begins with Gandalf discovering that the ring Bilbo has carried all these years is in fact the One Ring created by Sauron. And with evil beginning to rise once again from the bowels of Mordor, it's up to Frodo to keep the ring away from the hands of the enemy. But Frodo can't do this alone. He's joined by trusted friend Samwise Gamgee, who, once again, with only a few lines, becomes one of, if not the best character of the whole thing.
If I take one more step, it'll be the farthest away from home I've ever been.
They're eventually joined by troublesome hobbit duo Merry and Pippin, and soon enough the roster of characters expands even further, creating a 9-member group known as the Fellowship of the Ring, consisting of people from across Middle-earth, as the fate of the ring is a cause that affects the entire world. This fellowship includes Gandalf the Grey, of course, Boromir, son of the Steward of Gondor, Gimli, one of the proudest dwarves around, Legolas, one of the best elven archers, and finally Aragorn, the reluctant heir to the throne of Gondor. Together they've been given the perilous quest of taking the One Ring to Mordor, straight into the fires of Mount Doom, to destroy it once and for all the while facing off 9 ring wraiths, formerly the 9 men who held rings of power, and the wizard Saruman, formerly the wisest of all wizards, but now he is corrupted by evil, and has created an army of new warriors known as the Uruk-hai to carry out Sauron's will. Couple all of that with further setups regarding Aragorn and Arwen's relationship, specifically with her Evenstar, some fun little cameos like Peter Jackson popping in at Bree as Carrot Man, and it all comes together in a fantastic way. The story of Aragorn as the heir to the throne of Gondor could easily be the least interesting part of this whole story. You know, it's all about lineage and extensive backstory, but thanks to the depth and power that was given to it in the book, this movie is able to carry it to a new level. You're invested in the fate of men, as Gandalf believes that they are the people that will take Middle-earth into the future, and that future lies in the hands of Aragorn, should he choose to accept it. Audiences immediately became invested in this quest as they were swept off all across Middle-earth, finding themselves in many of this world's most breathtaking places. You got the small, quaint town of Hobbiton, the slightly gothic and eerie village of Bree, the grand history of Weathertop, the ethereal and otherworldly Rivendell, the enormous and awe-inspiring mines of Moria, and the secretive and equally ethereal realm of Lothlorien. Each location feels distinct, each location feels different, and it all helps create this sense of adventure and awe, despite the harrowing journey the characters are bound to go on. But one of the more ingenious things about this movie, and part of why the pace keeps up all the way through, is that it takes these books that were not necessarily action books and turns it more or less into an action movie. Peter Jackson has total reign over the action in this movie and creates some incredible set pieces, all rife with tension. You have the standoff with the ring wraiths on Weathertop, followed by a big horse chase right after, featuring some great visual effects work. work. This moment in particular was done by Digital Domain, because Weta became a little overwhelmed in the post-production process. Then you have a brief encounter with the Watcher in the water, this massive CGI creature, which leads into the biggest chunk of action, taking the characters through the mines of Moria. You got a massive battle with orcs, and even a cave troll, showing off all of the best technology in terms of visual effects, sound design, choreography, all in a single 3-minute scene. But where the Moria sequence really hits hard is at the Stairs of Khazad-dûm, though it wasn't intended to be as big of a sequence as it was. The script only said that the Fellowship traveled down the stairs and made their way to the bridge, that's all. And yet, when Peter Jackson first saw a drawing of the stairs done by Alan Lee, with cracks and breaks throughout, inspiration took over and this entire sequence came to be. Because the Fellowship find themselves at a gap in the stairs, and one by one they begin to jump across. But a wrinkle is thrown at them as suddenly orcs begin shooting them with arrows. All the while, the caves are beginning to collapse as one of Gandalf's greatest fears, a Balrog, is on approach. With each member of the Fellowship that jumps across, the Balrog draws closer. The cave collapses more until suddenly Aragorn and Frodo are the only ones left to jump. But more of the stairs collapse, widening the gap. They can't jump anymore, and they can't go back either, as the stairs behind them have also collapsed, and the platform that's left has begun to break loose, losing its stability. Everyone in the audience is gripping their seat until suddenly Aragorn says to lean forward, thus tipping the stairs forward until finally closing the gap, allowing Frodo and Aragorn to get across. The theme of the Fellowship plays at full power, all to give this huge sense of relief as the characters have made it past a major obstacle. And yet, to this day, the script only says that they simply run down the stairs. Ain't that crazy? But it all builds to the ultimate standoff of the movie, one of the most exciting sequences for Tolkien fans everywhere. The standoff between Gandalf and the Balrog. While the Balrog is only in a select few shots, boy does it make an impression. It's massive, it's imposing, the visual effects are incredible, and it all builds to one final moment. As on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, Gandalf makes his stand, declaring that the Balrog shall not pass, and breaks the bridge beneath its feet. With a massive climactic moment, Gandalf defeats the Balrog, but suddenly he's dragged down as well, leaving the Fellowship with nothing to do but watch.
Fly, you fools!
Despite only knowing this character for a brief 2 hours up to this point, this moment hits incredibly hard. The music, the visuals, the slow motion, it all helps carry this emotion. Not to mention getting a moment to see the characters react, see them break down. It makes the loss of Gandalf all the more tragic. But while that sequence would seem to be the massive climactic scene to end the movie takes another hour to really dive into the consequences. Specifically, how it all leads to the breaking of the Fellowship. A prediction told to Frodo by the one and only Galadriel. It's also worth noting that after Gandalf's death, the full heroic version of the Fellowship theme doesn't play again for the rest of the movie. All we hear is a far more somber, more broken down version of the theme. The seams are beginning to break around our heroes as this quest has already begun to take its toll. But before all hell breaks loose, there is one final moment to be left in awe, as the Fellowship come across the Argonath, these two massive statues that date back to the earliest days of Middle-earth. Not only is the scale of these things massive, but they, along with a lot of the other production designs in this movie, go a long way to hint towards the extensive history of Middle-earth. While the books could really dive into it, the fact that these pieces are still in here goes a long way to make this world feel lived in and feel like it's been going forever. It's one of the many aspects that makes it so easy to get sucked in, and the movie is all the better for it. But this is where the Fellowship finally falls, as they all wind up at Amon Hen, where Boromir, who has slowly been taken by the ring's power, finally breaks down, trying to take it from Frodo, exactly as Galadriel predicted.
Curse you! Curse you! And all our place!
and these breaks in trust are only exacerbated once a legion of Uruk-hai arrives, giving the film one massive final battle to close it out. And once again, Peter Jackson shows off some incredible action. There's lots of great little moments in here and some impressive camera work as the camera flies over the scene as Uruk-hai rush down the hill. And it also serves as a massive redemption moment for Boromir, as moments after cursing all halflings, he fights with no hesitation to protect Merry and Pippin. In fact, he fights to his death. But even with not one, but 2 arrows in his chest, Boromir continues to fight against the Uruks. He continues to protect Merry and Pippin, until finally a 3rd arrow takes him out of the fight. It's a great example of the movies taking an event from the books, the death of Boromir, and adding so much more emotional weight to it. The fall of Boromir here is genuinely emotional, and it gives this movie a bittersweet climax.
I would have followed you, my brother. Captain. My king.
But ultimately, the movie ends in tragedy. The Fellowship has broken, Merry and Pippin have been captured by Uruk-hai, with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli set to chase them down. And Frodo has left the others, set to take the ring to Mordor on his own. Although, of course, Sam won't let him go alone, because in one big moment, Sam proves once again why he's one of the best characters. His determination, his will to help Frodo complete this mission shine above all else. Frodo can't do this without Sam. It's good stuff, man. And together they finally rise into the mountains of Emyn Muil, with Mordor in sight as they truck off into the next leg of their journey. Not only is it an emotionally charged ending, but it also shows the pure genius of making the hobbits the principal characters in this story. Hobbits aren't naturally heroes. They're only 3.5 feet tall, and yet their courage, their strong hearts, and their will to do the right thing shine above all else. And as we watch Frodo and Sam march off closer towards Mordor, we know that they're going to try their damnedest to see this through to the end, which is where we close the book, pun intended, on Fellowship of the Ring. And audiences were left to sit in their seats, watching as the credits rolled, backed by May It Be by Enya, with only one thought on their minds. When do I get to see more? Fellowship of the Ring was a massive success. In fact, it exceeded expectations on all fronts. Reviews were incredibly positive, praising the visual effects, action, and the general mastery of storytelling shown by Peter Jackson and the entire team. The world of Tolkien had been brought to the big screen, and it had swept off die-hard fans, as well as a whole swath of new people into this fantasy land of hobbits, dwarves, and elves. There was no better reaction the filmmakers could have hoped for, as across its run, Fellowship of the Ring made a whopping $313 million domestically and $880 million worldwide. Just like the books had done all those decades before, the first Lord of the Rings movie had swept over the entire world. Despite the unconventional Christmas release, the movie single-handedly brought the same level of summer movie excitement to the month of December, becoming the biggest movie of December 2001 and January 2002. Audiences couldn't get enough. The characters, the adventure, the world, it was all too incredible to step away from. And the positive reception only continued from there, as it fed right into award season in the early months of 2002. Where, in a huge show, Fellowship of the Ring was nominated for a whopping 13 Academy Awards, including Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Director, and Best Picture. Ultimately, while it didn't take those awards home, Fellowship still went home with 4 Oscars. Best Cinematography for Andrew Lesnie, Best Makeup for Peter Owen and Richard Taylor, Best Original Score for Howard Shore, and Best Visual Effects for Jim Rigel, Randall William Cook, Richard Taylor, and Mark Stetson. The gamble paid off. Lord of the Rings was the talk of the town. It was the second biggest movie of 2001, only falling short of the first Harry Potter movie. But despite this enormous payoff to years of work, the crew still had a long road ahead of them. They still had 2 more movies to finish after all, with all hands now on deck for the second chapter, The Two Towers. With the first film down, Peter Jackson hunkered down and focused all energy he could onto the second movie, this time working with editor Mike Horton to bring this middle chapter to life, with additional editing done by Jabez Olson. Throughout their process, they had to cut together some of the biggest action scenes of the entire trilogy, all the while mapping their way through 3 concurrent plot lines, something the first movie didn't have to worry about because that one only told one single story. All the while, this second movie also carried with it one of the most unusual problems, a problem that not a lot of other filmmakers come across. Given that it was the middle chapter of a trilogy, The Two Towers didn't really have a beginning or an end. It just kind of was. While there were ideas to create a prologue to recap the events of Fellowship of the Ring, that idea was ultimately dropped in favor of just jumping into this new story. At the very least, they did have the massive Battle of Helm's Deep to serve as the second movie's climax, but troubles rose regarding the ultimate resolution, because, much like the book, the movie was set to conclude with a final confrontation with Saruman. It's a hugely pivotal scene to the story. It ties together lots of various ideas, and seeing as Saruman was essentially the main villain of this second movie, it seemed like a no-brainer to end it with this confrontation. But what Peter Jackson and the editors ultimately discovered was that this ending took a lot of air out of the finale. Audiences would have seen the big battle. They had the big climax, and they'd be itching to get home. Because of that, they'd be incredibly restless if the film added another 6 or 7 minute dialogue scene to close it out. They'd just become tired. So, like a lot of elements of the Two Towers book, this scene was instead moved up. It was now set to play at the start of Return of the King. It played a lot better as a start than an end, and allowed the Two Towers to come to a big and satisfying conclusion, even if the story still had one major chapter left to go. But what makes the Two Towers different from any conventional sequel is that not only is it a direct continuation of the events of Fellowship of the Ring, but it was also shot at the same time. While a traditional sequel would essentially start from scratch and somehow recapture the magic from the original and bring everything back to that same level, the Two Towers didn't have to do that. Since all 3 movies were shot at the same time, all Two Towers needed to do was maintain the magic and continue this story with the same level of detail and quality that they had the first time around. And while this second film was working with a new editor, Peter Jackson was still at the helm, helping to bring this next story to fruition in a way that seamlessly continued from where the last one left off. Though there was gonna have to be a little bit of recapturing, because much like Fellowship, partway through the editing process, Peter Jackson knew that they had to do a little bit more filming. So, once again, for another few weeks, the entire cast was brought back to New Zealand to film pickups for The Two Towers. These are big movies. Sometimes you need a little bit of polish to get them to the level you want. But despite the fact that these 3 films were shot simultaneously and that one would assume that the same level of quality was maintained, that didn't stop there from being some immense pressure going into film 2. The world had now been fully introduced to this story. They had been swept away, and so expectations might even be higher going into the middle chapter. And excitement was beginning to rise. As the months continued and the DVD release of Fellowship was still quite a ways out, fans started to get antsy for their next taste of Middle-earth. But they had a little bit to quench their appetites, as at the tail end of March, Fellowship got a brief re-release in theaters, this time featuring a full 4-minute tease to the Two Towers, including some all-new footage. But none of this footage would be released online, so folks who did not jump over to theaters again wound up missing out, only able to rely on online descriptions. But that drought didn't last too much longer, because finally, after 6 months since the release of Fellowship of the Ring, the clock finally turned to June 25th, 2002. Right smack in the middle of these 2 movies, the marketing push finally began on The Two Towers, kicking off with an all-new teaser trailer.
The fate of the world will soon be decided. The dominion of evil grows even stronger. There is a union now between the Two Towers, Barad-dûr, fortress of the Dark Lord Sauron, and Orthanc, stronghold of the wizard Saruman.
Across 2 minutes, this trailer brings us right back into the world of Middle-earth, teasing the next steps for these characters, introducing a whole swath of new faces, all the while showing that the adventure is only going to get more dire for our heroes. While there were dire stakes in the first one, this trailer promises that the battle for Middle-earth will begin, with action that would blow the first movie out of the water. It's fast, it's exciting, it established the meaning behind this movie's subtitle, and it also teased a character that was only glimpsed in Fellowship, Gollum. All the while it explodes in this showcase of imagery, set to the incredible music of the first movie. Audiences were ready, their journey to Middle-earth had only just begun, and they were pumped to strap in for this middle chapter. Whoa, right at the end, the teaser pulled out a massive reveal. After that massive clash in Fellowship, Gandalf was going to be back in an all-new look for the Two Towers. Although, despite the fact that this was an element from the book and was definitely an aspect that certain fans would already know about, some were still a little disappointed it was revealed in this trailer. Like, at least wait for the movie to come out to reveal that Gandalf is back. But hey, I bet this second movie is gonna knock our socks off either way. And as excitement built over the remainder of 2002, post-production was in full swing. With editing and pickups underway, the visual effects work was taken over by Weta Digital. Once again, Weta Digital had a momentous task ahead of them. In fact, the workload of visual effects on the Two Towers was significantly bigger than the workload for Fellowship of the Ring. While the first film required a sum total of around 500 visual effects shots, this one required nearly 800 visual effects shots, with Weta Digital ultimately tasked with creating visual effects for about 73 minutes of the movie, including the same tricks used in the first one, compositing, extended backgrounds, as well as continuing to use the program Massive, which the first film used to create massive armies of computer-generated soldiers during the prologue. But here, the use of Massive got a massive upgrade, as this time around, armies of Uruk-hai needed to be made for the climactic battle of Helm's Deep. You know, while the production did have 100 or so extras dressed up as Uruk-hai, Massive could expand on that and turn that number into 10,000. Then, of course, Weta Digital was in charge of creating all new digital characters for this new installment, one of which was a fell beast, a massive winged creature that would be used by the Ringwraiths. In the first one they got horses, this time they got big snake dragon things. Yeah. Then you had perhaps one of the more standout elements that Tolkien fans were already super excited to see, the Ents. Walking, talking trees, the most significant in this movie being none other than Treebeard. The effects on Treebeard were immense. For one thing, during production, a full-size animatronic puppet was made for Dominic Monaghan and Billy Boyd to interact with. It was almost like there was a third actor in the scene. I mean, technically there was, as John Rhys Davies was on set to provide his voice. But the only issue with the animatronic, as impressive as it was that the face did not move all that much. So, while still keeping as much of the puppet as possible, Weta Digital replaced the head and animated it with all the expressiveness their hearts desired. And when expanding to wide shots, you could really see the immense size of this character, which just gave this movie a whole other side to Tolkien's world that was previously left unexplored. But the biggest new addition in this second movie was none other than Gollum. While the first movie hinted at Gollum, he was going to be front and center this time around. There was only one problem. The team at Weta Digital had already created the model for Gollum, but when they started to line it up with the performance given by Andy Serkis on set, it didn't quite work. The model, specifically the face, just wasn't built for Andy Serkis, and so trying to match it to the performance proved immensely difficult. So it was decided rather late in the day that even though there was a Gollum that appeared briefly in Fellowship, the team was going to completely redesign him to better match Andy Serkis. This included remodeling his body and completely restructuring his face so that it moved the exact same way as Andy Serkis' face did. On top of that, Gino Acevedo, who had been doing tons and tons of prosthetic work for the movies already, was brought into the digital world to help perfect Gollum's skin tone. You know, give him veins, give him just the right unearthly color and translucency. His skills in this world were unmatched, and the digital team used them to great effect to translate it to their digital Gollum. But this only got part of the way there, as Andy Serkis was brought back to do motion capture capture on a stage, redoing all of the performance that he did on set so that it could be recorded back into the computer. Following up on the first film's use of motion capture, the process evolved here to get the best performance of Gollum possible. And it was all live. Anything Andy Serkis was doing, you could see a rough computer model doing the exact same thing.
It is this kind of confluence of all these different skills and people's energy that is making this thing special.
But even with how exciting the motion capture was, there were still drawbacks. While the technology could capture the movements of Andy Serkis's body, the finer details of the hands and the face were complete blind spots, which meant the motion capture team had to work hand in hand with the animators who could fine-tune and sometimes exaggerate the performance to bring out the best version of Gollum possible. A lot of that came in the face, which had to be completely keyframe animated at every turn. While still modeled directly off of Andy Serkis, the animation had to be done frame by frame for every single shot. Then there was another tactic of matching the animation of Gollum to the performance that Andy Serkis gave on the day, rotoscoping Andy Serkis out of the shot and replacing him with a Gollum that followed his movements quite closely. All because the takes with Andy Serkis present were very clearly the better takes, as everyone was giving a better performance when he was there versus the takes where he wasn't. Gollum ultimately became this incredible combination of both old and new technology to bring about something special and something that had never really been done before. But even then, there was still something missing, something integral about the character that the filmmakers didn't think was really coming across the way they wanted it to. And this was the dynamic between both halves of Gollum's psyche. The filmmakers had a very clear idea of how they wanted these two sides to operate, but this clarity wasn't really felt by the animators, and the filmmakers feared that it also might not be felt by the audience. And after finally breaking down the exact journey that Gollum was going to take and how it all made sense, it inspired the animators greatly, and also inspired Fran Walsh, who in a masterstroke wound up writing an entirely new scene from whole cloth, an entire scene between Gollum and Smeagol. The sides of this coin just talking to each other. It was a scene that really allowed Andy Serkis to stretch his acting chops and wound up being one of the few scenes that the animators mimicked one-to-one, as it was just a perfect representation of the Gollum-Smeagol dynamic. With all the work put into such a pivotal character, there was no doubt that Gollum was going to be one of the shining moments of the entire trilogy. And the extensive visual effects work done by Weta Digital would soon be glimpsed by the audience at large, as a few months after the first trailer, the marketing efforts were resparked for the final stretch of 2002, as on September 30th, New Line released the full trailer for The Two Towers. Across another 3 minutes, this trailer brings the heat. Once again, following in the footsteps of the teaser, this trailer shows that our returning heroes will journey across new lands and meet all sorts of new faces. All the while, the evil force of Saruman and his army of Uruk-hai are hell-bent on their quest to destroy the world of men. The stakes are higher, the tone is darker, the trailer even says that all will be sacrificed, and it all builds to an incredible montage of action and visuals, set to what would become one of the most iconic and recognizable pieces of trailer music.
The defenses have to hold.
They will hold.
There is nothing for you here, only death.
There is still hope.
Aw man, I am so ready to jump back to Middle-earth. This next installment is gonna knock my socks off, I can guarantee you that. We only got a few more months until Christmas, which was already becoming the most exciting part of the year. And in the final stretch, the post-production really heated up. On one side, there was the music, still under the helm of Howard Shore, who built upon the themes created for Fellowship and expanded into all new themes for the Two Towers. Some of the new characters got their own themes, like Éowyn embodying her own fears and her ambitions to do bigger things with Rohan. Then of course Gollum got not one, but two themes. One to hint towards the pity and more empathetic side of Smeagol, and another to hone in on the abusive, corrupting, and chaotic nature of Gollum. Then of course the Ents got their own theme, embodying their age as well as their journey throughout the story and how they impact the larger world. Then of course, perhaps the most significant new theme for the Two Towers was the theme for Rohan, as a lot of this second movie was going to center around this region and around these people. With all of the new themes and ideas, the Two Towers Towers was going to greatly expand what was heard in Fellowship. And on top of that, following in Fellowship's footsteps, an original song was written for the end credits, this time performed by Emiliana Torini, titled Gollum's Song, further cementing this character's importance to this second chapter. All the while, the sound design continued as well. With the same team on board, they continued from the work they had done to expand and improve their work on film too. One of the biggest challenges this time around was creating the sounds for these massive battles. They had to sound massive, they had to sound impacting, and yet they couldn't be overwhelming, or else the sound would just turn into mud. On top of that, because we're seeing these massive armies in their full glory, they had to sound as big as they looked. So during the process, the team made use of a cricket stadium full of people. Halfway through an exciting game, Peter Jackson walked out and directed the crowds to make the chants and sounds to bring these armies to life. The Ents were also hugely important. They were big, they creaked and croaked, all to give this sound of immense age, like these creatures have been around forever. Not only that, but John Rhys Davies' voice lines for Treebeard wound up being funneled through wooden boxes to manipulate the sound ever so slightly. You know, Treebeard's voice box is not the same as ours, so with these clever tricks, the voice was made to sound just a tiny bit different to really bring this character to life. Much like the first movie, the sound team worked tirelessly to create a soundscape that was entirely unique and full, and really captured the feel of Middle-earth. But the closer things got to the wire, the more hectic things became. The post-production on the Two Towers was significantly harder than the post on Fellowship. Music and sound was being done simultaneously with visual effects and editing, all in a mad dash to get this film through the door. In fact, the editing team was moved into the mixing hall so that Peter Jackson could jump between both areas at any given moment, though that did cause a lot of conflict between the mixers and the editors, as any change made by the editors immediately undid a lot of the work the mixers had done. Peter Jackson spent a lot of time in video calls with all of the separate teams working around the clock to finish the enormous movie ahead of them.
I just about pushed everybody to the limit, I think, of me doing some editorial changes, like with only days to go before the delivery of the film, but they're worthwhile. I mean, I just, you know, I sort of have this philosophy that nothing's ever perfect, that you simply run out of time.
But even with this extreme pressure, Peter Jackson did well to keep morale as high as possible. The entire team had a lot of fun. Peter Jackson even got to play a gong during one piece of music. And since they were mixing at Abbey Road Studios, Peter Jackson, Howard Shore, Rick Porras, Paul Brusek, and John Kurlander all went out and did what all tourists do. They took their own picture on the iconic Abbey Road crosswalk. When you're pulling these insane hours to get these movies done, you gotta have some fun along the way. I mean, come on. And at the same time, the filmmakers were able to get a sense of the excitement from fans, and that helped keep them motivated to get the movie done, as audiences were excited beyond measure for the Two Towers. But what if you'd only seen Fellowship once? What if you only saw it in theaters and needed a refresher? Well, not only was the VHS and DVD for Fellowship released in August, but an all-new DVD was released on November 12th, 2002. Nearly an entire year after the movie's release, the DVD came through with something a little unexpected: 30 minutes of additional footage. Fellowship of the Ring had now come out with an extended edition, meaning that not only could audiences revisit the story they saw in theaters, but also see a whole bunch of new stuff. Across the 30 minutes of new footage, audiences would see an extended prologue, this time detailing exactly how the One Ring betrayed Isildur, resulting in his death. There was an expanded intro to the Shire, narrated by Bilbo Baggins, and an extended conversation between Frodo and Gandalf. Bilbo and Frodo got a little bit of time together during Bilbo's party, kind of selling that relationship a little bit more. Some extra time is spent with some other hobbits before Frodo is officially given his mission to take the ring away from the Shire. Frodo and Sam see the elves heading to the Grey Havens, set to leave Middle-earth and journey into the west. After meeting with Aragorn, the four hobbits follow him to the Midgewater Marshes, showing that the path to Rivendell from Bree was not the most spotless journey. Not only that, but Aragorn himself is greatly expanded in this edition, as we get a far greater insight into his history, him being raised by the elves, as well as his relationship with Arwen, and how it all connects to the tales and stories from the distant past of Middle-earth. Rivendell is expanded quite a bit. We see an additional conversation between Boromir and Aragorn. The Council of Elrond gets a bit of an extension, as we see the characters argue a little bit more over the fate of the ring, as well as seeing seeing Boromir's own convictions shining through. And right at the end, we see the Fellowship leave Rivendell, being sent on this quest that they all know will be the most daring thing they've ever done. Once arriving in Moria, there's plenty more dialogue about the Mithril armor that Bilbo gave Frodo, even revealing that the Mithril was given to Bilbo by Thorin Oakenshield, tying things back to the Hobbit book. The battle in Moria is more or less the same, with some additional moments and additional swings against the cave troll, but where the movie expands greatly is in Lothlorien. We see a lot more of the build-up to Lothlorien, we see it hidden among the trees, and we spend a lot more time with Galadriel. We reveal her own Ring of Power, as well as see her bid farewell to each member of the Fellowship by giving each of them a specific item that will help them in their quest, which is also an element that would lead right into the Two Towers, as these items would be used by each and every one of these characters as the story continued. On top of that, we see another glimpse at Gollum as he continues to follow the Fellowship. We get a deeper look into Boromir's downfall and how the ring has taken its toll on him, which leads to the Battle of Amon Hen, just like in the theatrical version. Only this time there are a couple added moments of graphic violence that probably had to be cut so the theatrical version could get a PG-13 rating. And ultimately, the film ends the same way, with the Fellowship broken, each member heading their separate ways, with Frodo and Sam on approach to Mordor through the mountains of Emyn Muil. While it is ultimately still the same movie, these additional 30 minutes provide plenty of insight into the characters, the world, it expands on certain ideas the theatrical version could only hint towards, and perhaps most significantly, it gives audiences the ability to spend a little bit more time in Middle-earth. Because of that, it's no wonder why some would ultimately consider the extended edition to be the quintessential way of viewing this story, as it allows you to sink your teeth just that much deeper into this entire world. And with its release, audiences would be caught up with all sorts of additional information that would allow them to head right into the Two Towers, which, after the monstrous post-production cycle, after nearly all branches worked simultaneously to get this movie done on time, everything finally reached a head. The Two Towers had finally met its delivery date. Every aspect of the movie was completed, and the reel was sent off for duplication and distribution. Man, what a weight off the crew's shoulders. They had now completed work on 2 of these movies. And now, just like the year before, it was time to celebrate with audiences around the world. Once again, premieres took over several major cities as the Two Towers swept audiences away. Starting on December 5th in New York City, the filmmakers could finally begin to reveal their work to the entire world. And like the first movie, one of these premieres went to the New Zealand city of Wellington, once again bringing it back to home soil. And following in the footsteps of the cave troll statue, Weta Workshop dressed the Embassy Theatre with a massive statue of Gollum, reaching out towards the One Ring. And during this premiere, in a reveal that was incredibly exciting to New Zealanders, Peter Jackson and executive producer Mark Ordesky announced that the 3rd chapter, The Return of the King, would have its world premiere, its first premiere in December of 2003, in Wellington, New Zealand. The people of New Zealand were incredibly excited that the biggest and most expansive premiere was going to come back home. Return of the King was going to launch right in the center of their very own Middle-earth. Before that, though, excitement reached a fever pitch for Chapter 2. The Two Towers was going to be bigger, better, and bolder than the first, and it would continue to tell this massive and immersive story that would sweep up audiences worldwide. But even with the goodwill coming off the first movie, there was still a lot riding on the second installment. Did they successfully maintain the magic? Is the next chapter of the story still going to hold up to Fellowship? Is Gollum going to work? If the answers to these questions fell short, the trilogy could falter here, and the 3rd installment could be completely sunk. But audiences were confident, audiences were excited, as all finally led to December 18th, 2002. After a year since the release of Fellowship of the Ring, Peter Jackson and the entire team were back. It was time to jump back into theaters during one of the most exciting times of the movie-going year and re-enter the world of Middle-earth. While this movie doesn't open with a prologue like the first one, it does kick off by reorienting us into the world of Middle-earth. How? Well, it brings us right back to the scene in Fellowship where Gandalf faced off the Balrog. Only this time we see the whole thing. After they both fall from the bridge of Khazad-dûm, they plummet into the mountainous caves below. It's a startling way to open the movie, immediately thrusting us into an action beat, but it helps to bring us back to the same emotion that was felt in the first movie, all the while exploding into something entirely new, which leads us quite nicely into the next part of the adventure we're all set to experience. From here, this movie picks up right where the last one left off. The Fellowship has broken. Frodo and Sam are on their own to trudge their way towards Mordor. Merry and Pippin have been captured by the Uruk-hai, with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli hot on their tail to save them. Overall, this second chapter is a bit darker than the first one. You know, it was described by the filmmakers before the movie came out that this was the part of the story where things went from worse to worse. This is also reflected in the color grade, as some of the colors that might have popped in Fellowship have been dialed back a little bit. Despite that, this movie is significantly funnier than the first one. There's a lot of humor this time around, which brings a nice amount of contrast to the otherwise heavy nature of the story. A lot of this humor comes from Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn, who for the most part are having a bit of a blast running across the plains of Rohan.
I'm wasted on cross-country. We dwarves are natural sprinters. Very dangerous over short distances.
This cross-country sequence also gives us this line.
They're taking the hobbits to Isengard!
Which would soon evolve into one of the earliest viral videos on the internet. This immensely fun, fast-paced remix that includes some of the best moments and musical ideas across the two movies. It's a great time.
They're taking the hobbits to Isengard!
But even then, there's still some emotional weight to this story, as eventually Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli discover a mound of dead Uruk-hai, all killed by riders of Rohan in the night. The same Uruk-hai that captured Merry and Pippin, which leads them to only one conclusion. Merry and Pippin are also dead. Man, what a great performance by Viggo Mortensen right there. And boy, do I have an interesting piece of trivia about that for you. You see, they did a lot of takes of Aragorn kicking the helmet, all to get it to fly closer and closer to the camera, until finally, on the last take, Viggo Mortensen let out that yell. All because he'd actually broken his toe. He kicked the helmet so many times it broke his toe, and yet he turned it into performance. That's a fun piece of trivia, right? I bet I'm the first person who's ever talked about it. I'm kinda knowledgeable that way. Now, this movie is split across 3 separate plot lines all running simultaneously. The movie's jumping between all these places, and yet somehow it manages to keep it all straight. While there are long stretches where some characters are never seen, the movie packs enough into every scene to keep the momentum flowing, which is doubly impressive as this is yet again another 3-hour adventure. And once again, Lord of the Rings knocks it out of the park. Any worries that may have been had going into the second chapter were completely squashed. The magic is maintained, the beauty of Middle-earth survives, and the story continues to develop in exciting ways, putting all new challenges in front of our heroes. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, in their quest to find Merry and Pippin, instead come across an unlikely friend, none other than Gandalf the White. While it was revealed in the trailers, Gandalf's return is still a cheer-worthy moment, as all of these characters are swiftly reunited with an old friend who's ready to help turn the tide in the struggle for Middle-earth. And they all cross into the realm of Rohan, meeting tons and tons of new faces. You got Éomer, leader of the Riders of Rohan, Éowyn, a noblewoman and shield maiden, and of course Theoden, the king of Rohan. Though his rule has become corrupted, as Grima Wormtongue, who works directly with Saruman, has corrupted Theoden's mind, which makes Theoden this truly tragic character, as when this movie starts he's completely oblivious to the world around him, completely taken over by the dark magic of Saruman. In fact, he completely misses the moment when his son dies, an event he could have prevented had it not been for this corruption. Eventually, though, Gandalf is able to purge Theoden of the curse of Saruman, which leads to to this really impressive shot of Theoden returning to his former strength, as the evil washes away right in front of our eyes. But then all of the horror that he has missed finally dawns on him, as he realizes his only son is dead, and it all hits in one big wallop.
No parent should have to bury their child.
It all works to make Theoden one of the best characters in this middle chapter. And as Saruman is actively attempting to destroy Rohan, Theoden takes his people and flees to Helm's Deep, set to hide and let this storm pass. Meanwhile, it's revealed that Merry and Pippin survived the attack from the Riders of Rohan and have made their way into Fangorn Forest. It's a place that feels incredibly old. You hear the creaking in the sound, the wooden instruments of the music. But where Fangorn really begins to shine is with the appearance of Treebeard. Finally, the spectacle of the Ents was revealed to audiences. The combination of practical and visual effects works wonders to bring this character to life. I mean, at every turn, he really just looks like a walking, talking tree.
Tree? I am no tree. I am an Ent.
Oh, sorry, Treebeard, a walking, talking Ent. And while some might think that this slow, lumbering figure might wind up being boring, I don't think it turns out that way. His slowness, his demeanor, his voice, it all adds up to a unique character. And that gives me enough confidence to say, Treebeard is awesome, actually. He just has so many great lines.
I always like going south. Somehow, it feels like going downhill.
Which brings us to the third prong, perhaps the most significant part of this entire quest. Frodo and Sam inching closer and closer to Mordor. Only this time they're joined by none other than Gollum. And finally, audiences got to see all of the work the visual effects artists had done to bring this character to life. And by God, it worked. Holy cow, did it work, dude. Gollum looks incredible. The animation, the performance, the tragedy of this character shines through on all levels. And it gives this section of the movie one of the greatest characters ever brought to screen. Not only does Gollum bring out some conflict between Frodo and Sam, whilst also showing what the ring will do to Frodo over time, but this also shines a spotlight on the internal conflict of Gollum himself. Gollum and Smeagol are two clearly distinct sides of this character, who are constantly battling, as evidenced by the incredible scene where they talk to each other.
You don't have any friends. Nobody likes you. Not listening. Not listening.
But there's also a really great detail with the eyes, because they're a visual indicator of which side of his personality is actually in control. It all shows in the pupils. If his pupils are big and wide, that's innocent little Smeagol. If his pupils are small, that's the sinister Gollum. While this is most apparent in the scene where they talk to each other, you can also see it shine throughout the entire movie. At every turn, this element is consistent. And ultimately, every single aspect that brought this character to life winds up working wonders. Gollum and Smeagol most definitely became one of the greatest on-screen duos of all time. But this story also takes a dark turn, as Frodo and Sam are ultimately captured by Faramir, the brother of Boromir. Faramir himself is also ensnared by the ring, as its power really affects the minds of men. But not only that, after Smeagol has finally put his trust in Frodo, that trust winds up being shattered as Faramir's men capture him as well.
What did they steal?
Precious!
Which leads to Faramir taking the three of them to Osgiliath, all on the way to take them to the city of Minas Tirith to turn the ring over to Gondor to use it as a weapon against Mordor. Things aren't looking good for our principal heroes, and it all builds into a massive final hour, where all three of these plot lines build to an incredible showcase of action. Most significantly is the Battle of Helm's Deep, which is perhaps the crowning achievement of the entire trilogy. The whole thing is set up incredibly well. The men of Rohan are bunkered in this massive stone structure with 10,000 Uruk-hai on their way from Isengard, ready to attack. And Rohan only has 300 men to defend the keep, to stop the Uruks and protect the people that are hidden inside. That and Helm's Deep's one weakness is shown in crystal clear fashion. While the structure itself is a massive, seemingly unbreakable stone wall, there is one drain at the bottom, a single hole that Saruman plans to exploit. The stakes are clearly established. established, as this conflict will more than likely decide the fate of men, and every decision leading up is based in character. Aragorn wants to call for aid, but Theoden knows no one will arrive, and that they have to fight this themselves. All the while, on the other side of the world, essentially, Elrond and Galadriel speak to each other telepathically, deciding whether or not they can help, or whether or not they will. But that leads to the moment where, in the 11th hour, an army of Lothlorien elves arrives at Helm's Deep, ready to once again fight beside men as they had done all those years ago. It's a moment that's not in the book, and yet it provides this great catharsis in the movie, as it allows the feeling of hopelessness to evaporate a little bit. Reinforcements have arrived, fully trained elven soldiers. Maybe, just maybe, there's a chance. And all leads to the battle itself, as the Uruk-hai army have arrived, chanting before the wall. A move that was actually taken from the stunt people on set. Just to psych themselves up, they started banging their staffs on the ground and banging their chest. The crew loved it so much that it wound up becoming a big rallying cry for the Uruks as the battle was about to begin, creating an immense amount of tension. And with rain beginning to pour over the scene, it all leads to the moment when... the battle begins, and it is one of the greatest battle scenes in film history. That might seem like big praise, but it really all does come together. The effects, the camera work, the music especially plays a great part, as the countless themes developed by Howard Shore over these two movies are used to great effect to show which side is winning at any given moment. That and the geography is crystal clear. We know the layout of Helm's Deep, one long wall and then a big old tower on one side. It helps center us in every moment. We know where all of the characters are at any given time. But what this scene does the best is massive pendulum swings. The power shifts from one side to the other. It's constantly creating tension because it's clear who is winning and when. When the battle starts, the men and elves have the upper hand, firing arrows down at the Uruks. But then the Uruks pull out these ladders and begin to climb up the wall. The power shifts, but the people on the wall are able to hold them back. The power shifts again, but then the Uruks reveal their biggest weapon, as they finally utilize the weakness established earlier, the drain under the wall, and plan a massive explosive inside. And while Legolas tries to take down the Uruk who means to detonate it, the Uruk jumps into the hole and... it's the biggest pendulum shift of the entire battle. The wall has just been burst open, and Uruks are pouring in. You feel the tension shift at every moment. It really becomes this massive roller coaster of ups and downs that makes the entire sequence thrilling from start to finish. From here we have tons and tons of fun character moments, like Aragorn tossing Gimli across a gap in order to slice down some Uruks, and Legolas using a shield to skateboard down a set of stairs, shooting Uruks as he goes. That and the entire scene is backed by a fun rivalry between Gimli and Legolas, as they are constantly counting their kills throughout the entire thing. Not to mention there's a tiny little Peter Jackson cameo where he throws a spear at some Uruks, so that's fun. But there are sobering moments as well, as the Uruks greatly outmatch the men and elves, ultimately resulting in the death of nearly the entire elf force, including their leader Haldir. And following that, the Uruks burst through the gates of Helm's Deep and start pouring inside, forcing the men of Rohan to retreat. It's a massive battle. It spans nearly 40 minutes of the theatrical movie's runtime, and that runtime is also boosted by the times when the movie cuts away, as we see the other two threads all gearing up for their massive climaxes. After conferring with the other Ents, Treebeard reveals that they will not be taking part in this war. Despite everything, Merry and Pippin failed to convince them to step forward. But thanks to quick thinking from Pippin, he redirects Treebeard to a sea of dead trees, all cut down by Saruman. Which leads to one of my favorite moments of the trilogy, where even after this long debate about whether or not they would fight, the moment Treebeard sees all these trees dead, he calls upon the other Ents, who all arrive immediately to lay the hammer down. The music rises into this glorious theme as the Ents march towards Isengard and begin to retake the land that was once rightfully theirs. It's a sequence that is perhaps one of the best representations of some of Tolkien's themes. The natural world is fighting back against industrialization. Ents are destroying all of Saruman's creations, all the while breaking a dam and allowing the burst of water to flood the entire area, destroying everything in one fell swoop. It's a great sequence, and it comes together to form a second climax, on top of the one seen at Helm's Deep, where when all hope seems lost, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and Theoden ride out one last time, meeting the Uruks head-on. While it is a heroic moment, it could very well lead to their deaths. That is until Gandalf finally returns, and with him, Éomer with 2,000 riders of Rohan behind them. It's a huge moment of elation as this massive army of men rushes down this mountain, crashing into the Uruks and taking them down in one big swing. After all of the trials and tribulations of the battle, this moment brings it to a hugely satisfying end. And finally, in Osgiliath, Frodo and Sam wind up in an incredibly close encounter with a ringwraith. Frodo nearly puts on the ring, nearly alerting Sauron to his location, until Sam heroically stops him. Not only does this show how far Frodo has fallen and how the ring has nearly completely corrupted him, but it also builds to a great scene where Sam gets to show off just how awesome he is, because he gives this final speech that ties all three endings together, and also ties it all in with the theme for this entire story, as the question is posed, why are they still going? What do they have to hold on to?
There's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo. And it's worth fighting for.
And with that, despite his previous desires, Faramir lets them go, allowing them and Gollum to journey to Mordor on the final stretch of their quest. The Battle of Helm's Deep ends in success as the Uruks are driven away, and Isengard is successfully retaken with the Ents in complete control. It's a huge and climactic end to the second chapter, leaving audiences on cloud 9 as it all comes to a close. But despite how satisfying it is, there's still a long road ahead.
The battle for Helm's Deep is over. The battle for Middle-earth is about to begin.
And finally, as Sam and Frodo make their way away from Osgiliath, we see the results of the breach of trust on Gollum, as he and Smeagol plot together to kill the two hobbits and take the ring for themselves, all by taking the hobbits to her. It's a moment that Tolkien fans will no doubt recognize as a clear setup for Shelob's lair. And with that, as Frodo, Sam, and Gollum inch closer to Mordor, we fade out on movie number 2, with Gollum's song, performed by Emiliana Torini, playing over the credits, selling his treachery that will take us into the final chapter. Much like the first movie, The Two Towers was a smashing success. Reviews nearly across the board praised the movie for all of its best qualities, the visual effects, the performances, as well as the massive scale action scenes. In fact, reviews for The Two Towers might have even been better than the reviews for Fellowship of the Ring. Since people had gotten fully involved in this story by now, their investment with these characters and with this world had only grown, and The Two Towers managed to benefit greatly. And across its box office run, The Two Towers managed to surpass the massive take for the first movie to bring home a whopping $339 million domestically and $939 million worldwide. Lord of the Rings was one of the biggest franchises around, and Peter Jackson had seemingly single-handedly made December the new summer movie season, as people had started to become more excited for what Christmas would bring than what May would bring. The Two Towers continued the goodwill of the trilogy and even continued to wreak havoc over award season early in the year 2003. As when it was time for the Oscars, The Two Towers was nominated for a whopping 6 Academy Awards. While less than the first, it was still a massive achievement, and 2 of these awards would be taken home. Best Sound Editing for Ethan Van Der Ven and Mike Hopkins, and Best Visual Effects for Jim Rigel, Joe Letteri, Randall William Cook, and Alex Funke. While not as big of a turnout as Fellowship, the crew rejoiced in receiving this kind of support from the industry's biggest award show. And with this goodwill, Peter Jackson and the entire crew were hopped up and ready to go, with all hands on deck to bring this massive machine to a close with the third and final chapter, The Return of the King. This time around, to close out the trilogy, Peter Jackson entrusted the editing of Return of the King to Jamie Selkirk, a longtime collaborator, with additional editing done by Annie Collins. But they had a pretty massive task ahead of them. While this movie would have a conclusion, unlike The Two Towers, there were perhaps even more stakes going into this movie than either of the previous ones. Audiences had now become fully invested into this story, into these characters. If the ending dropped the ball, the whole trilogy would come crashing down, and the disappointment would be immeasurable. So Peter Jackson pushed himself and the editors to really bring about the strongest conclusion possible, which was made even more difficult because of all of the elements that were lifted from The Two Towers, such as the sequence in Shelob's lair, as well as the final confrontation with Saruman, which was already proving to be quite a headache to get working. But the machine was underway, post-production was moving swimmingly through the year, and over the spring and early summer months, promotion eventually began for the ultimate conclusion. Fans were antsy, they were raring to go for this final installment. Coming off of The Two Towers, there was nothing more exciting in 2003 than the climactic end of The Lord of the Rings. Audiences were all in, excitement was already reaching a fever pitch, and they hadn't even seen any footage yet. But that all changed as eventually, months after the release of The Two Towers, New Line finally released the first teaser trailer for Return of the King.
Every day, Frodo moves closer to Mordor.
How do we know Frodo is alive?
What does your heart tell you?
Across a brisk 60 seconds, this teaser provides hints and glimpses to the final stage in these characters' journey. After the two movies we've seen, the pieces are starting to click together. Gollum's want for the ring is stronger than ever, Aragorn gets the sword of the king, and every piece will unite for the battle that will decide the fate of Middle-earth. But that journey will not be an easy one. The harrowing part of this quest will continue to its end, and fans were already on cloud nine. These 60 seconds, while not the most expansive, were enough to tide audiences over. The countdown had now officially begun for December 2003, and all the while, post-production on Return of the King continued at full speed, and during the editing process, like the first two, it was realized that pickups were needed once again to bring this trilogy to a close. So, for another few weeks in a parking lot in Wellington, the entire cast and crew was brought back to Middle-earth one last time. There were tons of sets in this one small place, as several units were filming scenes simultaneously, and Peter Jackson jumped between them day in and day out, all on his trusty bicycle.
Highly sophisticated transport mode. Very, very big budget mechanical device.
Sets were being turned around within the day, as there were so many scenes to film in a short period of time. But what the pickups did allow for was for the cast and crew to return to some scenes filmed at the tail end of principal photography. There were some scenes where they felt like they rushed through them, but now they could spend a bit more time and make them better, make them right. On top of that, across these pickups, there was another scene filmed with Andy Serkis as Gollum. But given the time constraints, there wasn't going to be any way to film Andy Serkis on set, then do motion capture on a stage a few months later. So instead, the crew opted to do both at the exact same time. They were filming the footage and capturing Andy Serkis' motion all in one go, which was a hugely significant advancement in the technology, as it sped the process along by a ton.
So he doesn't have to do mocap on this now and some other things? This is the first time in the history of cinema this has ever been...
I don't know.
We'll say yes.
We'll say yes.
We'll take credit.
But perhaps the most surprising part of Return of the King pickups was how emotional it all became. This was the last time the cast would all be together, the last time they were filming scenes in this world. What started as simply putting the finishing touches on the final installment wound up becoming a series of emotional goodbyes. As one by one, each cast member filmed their last scenes, with each of them being given gifts, most likely a prop, that they'd all take home as a keepsake from this immense journey. John Rhys Davies in particular got his last Gimli face prosthetic, but this one wasn't actually a keepsake. Because of the fact that the prosthetic was so irritating to wear, it was given to John Rhys Davies so he could burn it. I mean, what other kind of cathartic moment can you ask for? Viggo Mortensen and Bernard Hill were given a big farewell by the stunt team as they all performed a haka, a New Zealand performance often reserved for people of high stature within the community. So it was a gift truly earned by these two actors. Then there was Elijah Wood, whose goodbye was perhaps the longest, as on his final day, on his final shot, Peter Jackson kept doing take after take just to make sure he could get it right. But even after it seemed like they'd nailed it, they kept going. More and more takes. Peter Jackson just didn't want it to end. But eventually, like all good things, it had to end, resulting in one of the most emotional goodbyes for the crew, as Elijah Wood, essentially the main character, had concluded his trip to Middle-earth. And with that, the pickup shooting on Return of the King came to a close. It was an emotional time, as slowly but surely each aspect of the production wound down, and they realized that their time in Middle-earth was coming to an end. But in the months before release, there was still plenty of work to be done by Weta Digital. Over the couple years of making this trilogy, Weta Digital's tools and tricks had massively improved. They'd honed their skills in huge ways over these movies, and it all came together in a massive showcase for Return of the King. Where Fellowship had about 500 visual effects shots, and The Two Towers had 800 visual effects shots, Return of the King blew both of those out of the water with nearly 1,500 visual effects shots. From set extensions, miniature compositing, the continued use of massive to bring these larger-than-life armies to fruition. In fact, the armies this time were so much larger than they had been for the last two. Where The Two Towers had an army of 10,000 Uruk-hai in the Battle of Helm's Deep, Return of the King featured upwards of 200,000 orcs in the Battle of Pelennor Fields. That's a lot of orcs. There were also new creatures this time. Most significantly was the Oliphants, or Mumakills. While they were teased in The Two Towers, their use in battle was put through in full force for Return of the King. That and the Battle of Pelennor Fields was a huge undertaking. It was the biggest, most central set piece of the movie, and the logistics of getting it to work were insane. Because of the scope of the location and the geography of all of the armies, Pelennor Fields wasn't going to be real. It was going to be a massive 3D computer environment, stitched together with live-action photography on the many sets that would bring it all together. The design of Pelennor Fields was helped in large part by Alan Lee, who had the entire area mapped out in his head, and was able to help translate it into the digital world, all of which created the most expansive and biggest set piece of the entire trilogy. Then, of course, there was one of the most exciting, yet most terrifying sequences for Peter Jackson, the sequence in Shelob's lair. Peter Jackson is arachnophobic. He's deathly afraid of spiders, a fact that was well known within the team for this movie. But instead of shying away from this sequence with the massive spider, Peter Jackson went all in. All of his fears would manifest in this deeply, viscerally terrifying sequence where Frodo comes across this demon spider. The design, the animation, all of it maximized the terror and utilized Peter Jackson's own fear of spiders to really get across this feeling of absolute horror. It wound up being one of the most fun sequences to work on, maybe because of, or in spite of, Peter Jackson's fear of spiders. But even with this mountain of work ahead of the Weta Digital team, what really did it in was that, in a quest to make Return of the King as good as it could be, Peter Jackson realized day in and day out that they needed more shots, or that shots needed to be changed. So despite shots being completed every day, the number of shots the team still had to complete was going up, not down. With every day that passed, the workload got bigger. There were more shots coming in every day, including the pickups, ideas Peter Jackson had, and even some connective tissue shots that helped tie scenes together, like a significant moment with Gollum, the reference of which was filmed in Peter Jackson's house with Andy Serkis, because they didn't have any sets anymore and just needed something to base this new performance on. The workload on Weta Digital this time around dwarfed the workload on the first two, but it was all in service of making this the best conclusion it could possibly be. And thankfully, they knew that fans were still reeling with excitement as the months continued. December couldn't come soon enough, and excitement would only skyrocket from here, as on September 23rd, 2003, New Line released the full trailer for Return of the King.
The eye of the enemy is moving. The end has come.
Across another 3 minutes, this trailer does nothing but build and build. It is the darkest hour in Middle-earth. The biggest battle is upon us and the characters, and this chapter will define everyone involved, no matter the outcome. What this trailer focuses on the most, though, is the rise of Aragorn, and how he will fulfill his destiny and take up the sword of the king and lead the people of Middle-earth into a final battle against Mordor. All the while, we pick up on the cliffhanger ending of Two Towers and begin to hint further at Gollum's treachery, all the while showing the evil of Mordor. This journey may take these characters' lives. It will take them to the brink, and audiences couldn't wait to see this entire journey fulfilled. And as the months continued, post-production was in full swing, as all hands were on deck to finish this final installment with one big swing. On the music side of things, Howard Shore continued to develop new themes and new ideas, building off of what was heard in the first two to bring this entire operatic symphony to a close. The major new addition was the theme for Gondor, as it would be the biggest and most significant location in this final chapter. It was a theme that would capture the hope and heroism of men, even when everything else would seem hopeless. And like the first two, an original song was created, this time performed by Annie Lennox. While there was an early version of the song crafted for the end credits, it ultimately didn't feel right. As good as it was, it didn't fit the end of this journey. So a new song was written, inspired in part by young New Zealand filmmaker Cameron Duncan, who was friends with Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh before his untimely passing. This new song, Into the West, was a song written as kind of a farewell to him, as well as in part being a farewell to this universe. It carries a lot of emotional weight, and it was able to give this final outing the bittersweet ending it deserved. Not only that, but the bass melody that backed the chorus of the song was then worked into plenty of moments throughout the movie itself. All moments that dealt with the idea of death and the idea that this is where it was all coming to an end. Then there was a rather integral scene in the middle of the movie that featured a song sung by Pippin, a song that was melancholy, it was rather somber, which played perfectly against this larger-than-life scene. And Billy Boyd actually sang the song, working with lyrics written by Philippa Boyens based on a poem that was in the Fellowship of the Ring book to really accentuate this moment and bring this eeriness to it, ultimately creating one of the best little moments in the movie. All the while, at the same time, the sound design was also ongoing, with tons and tons of new and returning sounds for all of the creatures, effects. It was all coming together in a massive way. And the sound team had a blast creating and recording sounds for the movie. I mean, in order to get the right sound for the trebuchet catapult sequence at Minas Tirith, they dropped a massive brick of concrete onto the ground and recorded the sound it made. Then you had Shelob, who, building off of Peter Jackson's fear, Shelob became this slimy, gross, writhing kind of creature that the sound team had a blast just making the most disgusting and visceral sounds imaginable. Then, on top of that, the sound work also managed to fuel and inspire more of the animation work, which made the entire process incredibly collaborative.
About a week later, all of the Shelob animators trucked over to the sound studio, and we were just blown away.
All the while, audience excitement was reaching a fever pitch, and that excitement was boosted even further on November 18th, 2003, with the second DVD release of The Two Towers. I say second because the theatrical version had already released in August. This DVD, following in the footsteps of Fellowship of the Ring, was the extended edition, with nearly 45 minutes of extra footage. The extended edition of Two Towers adds plenty of little moments with the characters, expanding their harrowing journey, spending a little bit more time with Gollum and how Frodo ultimately tamed him at the start of the story. There's an expansion to Rohan. Specifically, the extended edition sees the funeral for Theoden's son Theodred, further cementing the tragedy of his character. Action sequences were made a bit bigger with extra slashes and slices. Without theatrical ratings to worry about, the action in the extended edition can be just a little bit more violent. Fangorn Forest gets a pretty significant expansion, with the entire forest of trees, not just the Ents, shown to be living and moving creatures, which is exemplified when one tree tries smothering and crushing Merry and Pippin, which also ties back to Old Man Willow from the books. Merry and Pippin themselves get a bit of an expansion, literally in this case, as their time with Treebeard winds up making them grow about 2 inches taller, creating a little bit of a fun rivalry as they continuously argue about their height. But the biggest expansion here no doubt comes from Faramir, who, after meeting him, we get a massive flashback with him and his brother Boromir in the city of Osgiliath. We get to see this dynamic firsthand, we get to see these two brothers interact, and in a direct tie-in to Return of the King, we get a pretty significant taste of Howard Shore's heroic theme for Gondor. And in another tie-in to Return of the King, we meet Denethor, Boromir and Faramir's father, who loves Boromir and kinda hates Faramir. The scene establishes their dynamic and also carries a little bit of tragedy, as this would be the last time they would all speak to each other, as the scene ends with Boromir rushing off to Rivendell to become part of the Fellowship. The scene also greatly helps Faramir's character, as his decision to take the ring to Gondor is further motivated by his quest to try and win his father's favor. It's good stuff and cements why these extended editions are so beloved, because they really do expand and explore these characters. And while The Two Towers ultimately ends the same way, there is a lot more resolution this time. We see Merry and Pippin find Longbottom Leaf and Isengard, we see Frodo and Sam leave Osgiliath, all the while informing Faramir of their exact path, which helps give a sense of dread for the third chapter, as Faramir suspects that Gollum is up to something. As the Uruks are stormed away from Helm's Deep, we see the trees of Fangorn swallow them and kill them, bringing that sequence to a pretty clean-cut conclusion. And of course, there's a payoff to the rivalry between Legolas and Gimli, as they finally tally up their kills. While the extended edition is significantly longer, it helps expand on the story in great ways, all the while, again, allowing people to spend just that much more time in this universe and with these characters. And the lead-ins to Return of the King only boosted excitement, as audiences were counting the days in the last months of the year. So was the crew behind the scenes, as the final stretch to finish the movie was a massive undertaking.
Normally in post-production, you edit the film, lock your picture, and you do the visual effects, and then you'll score the film. Then you start your final mix.
But we're not talking normal here.
Yeah.
Every single aspect of post-production was working around the clock. New visual effects shots were coming day by day. In fact, in the last 2 months of visual effects for Return of the King, Weta Digital had more shots to complete than the entirety of Fellowship and Two Towers combined. These weren't small shots either, they were massive, with plenty of artists saying that the work done on Fellowship was child's play compared to what they were doing on Return of the King. Music was being finalized until the last minute, the sound design and mix was all happening right down to the wire, as was the editing process, which included one of the biggest editing headaches: the final confrontation with Saruman, as inherited from the Two Towers. But even with it playing at the start of Return of the King, it became harder and harder to really get it to sell as the beginning of this movie. So the drastic and immensely difficult decision was made to cut it from the movie. It was a move that greatly angered Christopher Lee, news of which was inevitably made public, revealing to audiences that this scene would ultimately not make it into the movie. It wasn't a great way to end the working relationship with Peter Jackson and Christopher Lee, which is unfortunate. But either way, the scene was ultimately cut from the movie, all in an attempt to streamline the opening of the movie and get into the story of Return of the King as fast as possible. As post-production continued, meetings were held with all of the department heads as the clock wound down closer and closer until delivery. The post was so incredibly down to the wire that they, in fact, passed the wire. The delivery was initially set for the end of October 2003, but the mixing continued right into November. Picture wasn't locked until about November 12th, music wasn't done until about November 15th, and it was one of the rare occasions where the final sound mix was done before the visual effects were all completed. But finally, after many sleepless nights and a full 48-hour process to get the last shot through the door, it was finally done. Return of the King was finally finished, with mere days left before the world premiere. The movie was delivered, all of the reels were sent off, and every person involved in the post-production process breathed a heavy sigh of relief. After all of these years, the Lord of the Rings trilogy had just been completed.
You know, it's important to have experiences, and at least this has been a good experience in how to deliver a film at the last minute. You know, so we all know how to do it now. Should it ever come in handy again in the future?
And as promised a year before during the premiere cycle for The Two Towers, the world premiere for Return of the King was in fact held in Wellington, New Zealand. And once again, Weta Workshop dressed the Embassy Theatre with another massive sculpture, this time of a fell beast overlooking the area. They really do knock it out of the park every time. Middle-earth had come home for one final installment. The entire cast, plenty of the crew, they were all there with fans in a massive celebration of both this film and its impact on New Zealand as a whole. There was a massive parade with each of the cast and crew carted through the entire city. The whole city was dressed with posters and memorabilia. Up to 150,000 people turned up to experience the premiere, to be there for this massive moment. And as the month of December continued, following premieres were held across the world as audiences were slowly but surely getting sucked into this final chapter. The premiere in Oslo, Norway even included a massive stage reenactment of the events of the first two movies before the third one started, all orchestrated and planned over about 6 months. It was huge. The days were ticking by as excitement went beyond the fever pitch and instead skyrocketed to levels never seen before. Lord of the Rings was the film event of the year. The conclusion of this journey was the most exciting thing that audiences could ask for. The stakes were still off the charts. You know, this third chapter really had to stick the landing. But the goodwill coming off the first two left audiences with nothing but excitement going into Return of the King. And it all finally led to December 17th, 2003, where after a massive 8-year journey, after the first two chapters had swept over the world with critical acclaim, the end had now arrived. It was now time to jump over to theaters one last time for the final visit to Middle-earth. This movie opens in a rather peculiar way, with a flashback to Smeagol some 500 years ago. It might seem like an inconsequential scene at first, but that feeling suddenly evaporates once he and his friend Deagle discover the One Ring. In a scene expertly directed by Fran Walsh, the ring immediately ensnares Smeagol, turning the two friends against each other, resulting in Smeagol, without any hesitation really, killing Deagle. And as such, we flash over the next few hundred years as Smeagol slowly withers down and mutates into the Gollum we all recognize. It's a haunting scene, a pulse-pounding and unexpected way to open the movie, but it squarely recenters focus back on the One Ring and its power to corrupt virtually everyone. And with that, we flash back to Frodo and Sam, who follow Gollum closer and closer to Mordor as we enter the third and final leg of this massive journey. Which leaves the most daunting question for audiences worldwide. Is this finale any good? Thankfully, it's absolutely fantastic. Return of the King sticks the landing in more ways than one. The story is huge, the characters are all brought to satisfying places, and the harrowing journey comes to a close in a massive climactic showcase of visual effects, action, and the biggest emotional wallop the trilogy has to offer. From minute one, audiences were right back into this world, strapped in for their final adventure, as they began to watch as the first half of this movie elaborately sets the stage for the grand finale. Each character moves around the board, being put in just the right spot for the action that's set to ensue. Frodo and Sam inch closer and closer to Mordor, with Gollum sowing seeds of deceit in Frodo's mind, turning him against Sam, which ultimately builds into a big turning point, as Frodo and Gollum wind up leaving Sam behind, further cementing Gollum's treachery. Gandalf and Pippin have journeyed to the realm of Gondor, specifically the massively impressive city of Minas Tirith. I mean, look at this place. Look at how cool it looks. Here they meet the steward of Gondor, Denethor, who's all but lost his mind thanks to the discovery that his son Boromir is dead. And that madness continues throughout this side of the story, as he willingly sends his other son Faramir to Osgiliath, ultimately to die. Then he freaks out when Faramir comes back seemingly dead. Man's really lost it, let me tell you. But Minas Tirith is under threat. Orcs are amassing before the city, and Gondor must call for aid, leading to one of this movie's greatest sequences, the lighting of the beacons. It's a scene entirely carried by the music and visuals. It's a scene that takes words and ideas from the book and utilizes them to great effect in visual form. It's a scene that embodies the entire theme of this final installment. The race of men must unite to fight the forces of evil, and across the mountains between Gondor and Rohan, the two worlds are linked. The music carries it, the visuals are incredible. It's one of the biggest fist pump moments in the movie.
The beacons are lit! Gun knuckles for aid!
And Rohan will answer.
More pieces are moving. Rohan amasses their own army of horse riders. All the while, Aragorn is given the sword Anduril, forged from the shards of Narsil, the same sword that Isildur used to cut the ring from Sauron's hand. And with it, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli travel into the paths of the dead to summon an army of the dead. Yeah, we're bringing dead people into this. It's awesome. You know what else is awesome? The design of these guys. They're all skeletal and rotten, and the main guy is constantly fading between a prosthetic and a computer-generated skull underneath. It's such a cool visual. And it was a big shock to the crew when they found out that Pirates of the Caribbean did a very similar thing earlier that year. This is like that saying, you know, great minds and something or other.
The board is set. The pieces are moving.
You said it, Gandalf. The stage has been set for the ultimate final stand. All the while, Gollum's treachery is finally revealed as he leads Frodo into Shelob's lair. The creepiness and horror really comes through during this sequence, from the set design to the music and, of course, to Shelob herself. I'm not particularly arachnophobic, but when this spider's crawling around making those unearthly sounds, that's creepy, that's scary, and it results in one of the most tense sequences of the entire movie. And it ultimately leads to a big moment where Sam returns, coming to Frodo's aid and fights off Shelob in a heroic clash. Yeah, you go Samwise Gamgee, take out that spider. Another thing that this movie does really, really well is scale. This movie is massive. We see masses of armies at every turn. Like the moment the armies of Rohan are finally assembled and they begin to ride out towards Minas Tirith. Even though this army is set up to not nearly be big enough to face off the armies of Mordor, this shot is still super impressive, until you suddenly realize why they won't be able to stand against the armies of Mordor, as we start to see this massive orc army barrel out of Minas Morgul. Already there looks like there's a lot of them, but that's only the beginning, because we leave this scene for about 20 minutes and then we cut back and we see that the army is still coming out of Minas Morgul. Like, how many of these guys are there? Turns out there's hundreds of thousands of them, all gearing up for the assault on Minas Tirith. And here, the final battle begins, the ultimate fight for the fate of Middle-earth. It's a scene that's so much bigger than the battle for Helm's Deep, and yet continues to use all of the same tricks to make this equally as exciting. We got geographical clarity, we got tons of little character moments, and of course, we got pendulum swings. And these pendulum swings are absolutely massive. The shifts of power are felt at every turn, as each side pushes the other back, trying their best to gain territory and defeat their enemy. At first, the orcs have the upper hand, launching rocks at the city, but once Gandalf takes control of Gondor's armies, they turn the tide, with trebuchets launching debris right back into the orc army. But it's not enough, as the orcs begin storming the city, breaking over the wall. That and the ring-wraiths, led by the Witch King, fashioned with a sick-looking helmet, are storming the city from above. But the Gondorian soldiers and Gandalf are able to hold them back, at least for now, because the orcs have brought in Grond, a massive wolf-like battering ram to bust down the gates of Minas Tirith. And by nightfall, Grond is in position and finally bursts through the gate. Ground is being lost on the side of Gondor, as they're all forced to retreat to the second level of the city, as the ground level is suddenly overrun. And by the time the sun comes back up in the morning, the orcs have swarmed even farther, barreling through Gondorian soldiers at every turn. That is until... In a moment that brought cheers to theaters across the world, the riders of Rohan have finally arrived. The two worlds of men are united at last, as Theoden psychs up his army, literally chanting the word death, as they know this will likely be their end. And with a massive charge of the Rohirrim, they manage to turn the tide against the orcs, blasting through the army without remorse. The music, the visuals, the performances, everything comes together to make this one of the most fist-pump-worthy moments in the entire trilogy. It just makes you want to stand up and salute to Rohan. It's so good. But the pendulum isn't done swinging just yet, as even though Rohan has turned the tide is about to turn right back. That's right, the Oliphants are here, commanded by the ruthless Haradrim. Once again, scale is a huge factor here as they immediately begin to wipe the floor with Rohan's forces. I mean, these things are huge. The horses are tiny specks compared to them. It's no match, and the battle begins to turn ill once again. The forces of Rohan are nearly spent, which is made even worse when the Witch King storms onto the scene, dealing a massive blow against Theoden, which ultimately results in his death. At the same time, Gandalf and Pippin are trapped in one of the higher levels of Minas Tirith, as the orc army has nearly barreled all the way to the top. And even though Éowyn stands between the Witch King and Theoden, it's clear she's no match. And worse yet, another of Sauron's armies has arrived, this time in Corsair ships. But actually, it's not the Corsairs. The ships have been taken over by Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. Now, you might be thinking, how can these guys turn the tide of battle? There's only 3 of them. Well... in one final pendulum swing, the dead army swarms over the battlefield. Legolas and Gimli continue their rivalry, counting their kills, but Legolas definitely wins this time, and he's showing off as he does it. In a massive moment, Legolas climbs onto the back of an elephant, takes out tons of Haradrim on top, all before cutting this entire carriage off the top. And then, in one final move, he shoots the elephant in the head and slides down its trunk as it collapses to the ground. It's so over the top, and that little look Legolas gives at the end proves one simple thing. He knew exactly what he was doing.
That still only counts as one!
And at the same time, Éowyn takes her final stand against the Witch King, who declares that no man can kill him. But with the help of Merry, Éowyn winds up throwing that right back in his face.
I am no man.
It's a hugely satisfying moment. The Witch King is defeated. The dead army rush through Minas Tirith, successfully destroying the orcs, leaving the battle victorious. It's massive, it's exciting, there are so many moving pieces, and yet every part of this battle is clear and concise, as well as being visually super impressive. The visual effects, coupled with all of the set design and practical armor, it all comes together for one of the biggest visual spectacles ever put on screen. And thanks to those pendulum swings, it's successfully becomes a massive roller coaster of emotions, one that ultimately ends in relief. But the journey isn't quite over yet. There's one last leg to go, as Frodo and Sam, having escaped the clutches of the orcs and taken on their armor for disguise, have finally made it to Mordor. And just outside, Aragorn, Gandalf, Legolas, Gimli, Merry, and Pippin have amassed the last of Gondor and Rohan's forces at the Black Gate, all in a ploy to distract Sauron to give Frodo and Sam an avenue to reach Mount Doom. This is the final leg of the journey. This is the final stand. The people of Middle-earth have no idea if they're going to survive. In fact, judging by the size of Sauron's army, they probably won't.
I thought I'd die fighting side by side with an elf.
What about side by side with a friend? I could do that.
All the while, inching closer and closer to Mount Doom, Frodo is seen literally crawling up the mountain, the weight of the ring taking its toll. It's one of the best little moments because it shows that despite this momentous task, Frodo is still determined to see it through to the end. And the music sells it as well. It's not a big heroic track. It's a variation on the theme of the Shire. These light flutes that carry out the innocence of hobbits even in Frodo and Sam's most desperate hour. And it also gives Sam one final opportunity opportunity to show off just how awesome he is, because when Frodo's energy is spent, when he can't take one more step, Sam takes on the entire burden and carries him to Mount Doom.
I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you.
This entire finale is rife with emotion. It's so heavily charged through the music, the visuals, every single part of this trilogy has led to this moment. And even back at the Black Gate, audiences would find themselves cheering at two simple words.
For Frodo.
It's a sequence that, cheesy as it may be to say it, shows off the true power of cinema. To transport people into another world and get them completely invested in the characters. This moment exemplifies that above all others, as audiences were just like Merry and Pippin, charging right after Aragorn into the final battle. And after another confrontation with Gollum, Frodo and Sam finally enter Mount Doom. This is it. This is what we've all been waiting for. It's time for Frodo to drop the ring into the lava and end this quest once and for all. But the ring is powerful. The ring is all-encompassing, and right at the last moment, it finally breaks Frodo.
The ring is mine.
He puts on the ring, alerting Sauron to his presence. The battle outside begins to go south. Aragorn can't hold off against a massive troll, and Legolas is unable to save him. Things get worse inside when Gollum appears and bites off Frodo's finger. With every moment, there's a new turn. Audiences had no idea what was going to happen next, and the tension was higher than ever. But the feeling of relief from Gollum was unmatched. The ring he had lost for so many years was finally back in his possession. And here comes perhaps one of the most significant changes from the book. Because after the moment Gollum gets the ring, the book sees him dance his heart away. He's got the precious, he's gotten all he wants, and in his celebration, he slips off the side and plummets into the lava. Now, to the filmmakers, this wasn't exactly the most satisfying way to play the ending. It made Frodo too much of a passenger in the final moment. So instead, as Gollum dances his heart out, Frodo stands up and battles him one last time for the ring, until, in their struggle, they both fall off the side. Now, let me just pause for 1 second, because I really like the editing of this scene. There's a specific way it's put together that maximizes the tension, because even though the ring is sitting on top of the lava, it doesn't sink in. Instead, we cut back to Frodo hanging over the ledge and Sam reaching out to grab him. We cut back to the ring, its engraving suddenly glowing a bright red, but it still doesn't sink in. We cut back to Frodo still hanging off the edge. He can't grab hold of Sam's arm because his hand is too bloody. Instead, you just see this look in his eye. He's so unbelievably tired, and he knows that there's an easy way out. If he lets go, it all ends here. But Sam pleads for him not to. He shouts out at him to grab on. The emotional charge here is unmatched, as the audience also desperately wants Frodo to grab hold. Until finally, with one final act of courage, Frodo finds the strength and grabs onto Sam's arm. Bloody hand be damned. And then, and only then, does the ring finally sink into the lava. Which leads into what is perhaps the most satisfying 2 minutes in film history, as the entire army of Mordor crumbles away as the power of the ring completely vanishes. Not only that, but Sauron atop the Tower of Barad-dûr falls as well. The entire tower crumbles into pieces, collapsing more and more before erupting in one of the most satisfying explosions of all time. This massive wave of relief washes over the audience. The ring has finally been destroyed. Sauron has finally been defeated. Each member of the Fellowship celebrates as Frodo and Sam swiftly escape Mount Doom as it explodes. The journey is complete. The mission succeeded. And yet, we still have another 30 minutes to go. Because a journey this long, a journey this dense, can't simply be wrapped up in a 2-minute epilogue. Instead, the movie takes its time to tie up all loose ends, to give every character a satisfying conclusion. And it's a 30-minute ending that brings out the waterworks, as one by one we say goodbye to the characters and locations that we've been following for all 3 movies. The Fellowship reunites at last, Aragorn is crowned King of Gondor, uniting the forces of men and taking Middle-earth into its 4th age. And on top of that, Aragorn and Arwen finally reunite, getting back together after this entire journey. But where this scene particularly hits hard is when the 4 hobbits bow before Aragorn. But he does not accept, instead saying,
You bow to no one.
I mean, it just hits so hard, man. Everyone is bowing for them. These 4 little hobbits, they changed the world. I'm not crying, you're crying. And then the 4 hobbits return home, back to the lush green countryside of the Shire. Much like the adventure of Bilbo Baggins before them, they had gone there and back again. But even then, while the Shire remains completely the same as how they left it, these 4 hobbits have been irreversibly changed because of the journey that they have taken. It's one of the best little moments in the finale, as they all share knowing looks with each other. This is a shared experience, one only they will be able to fully comprehend, and it's an experience that has changed them immensely. Frodo especially, because even though Sam finally gets together with Rosie Cotton, Frodo feels that he can't go back to the way things were. So, after writing his own story in Bilbo's book, he decides to join Bilbo at the Grey Havens and leave Middle-earth. And here come the waterworks again, as Merry, Pippin, and especially Sam all pay their incredibly emotional goodbyes to Frodo. The music hits incredibly hard, the performances are top-notch, and it no doubt left everyone in the theater a blubbering mess. But with a knowing smile from Frodo, he sails away into the Undying Lands, leaving Middle-earth forever. And Sam returns home, reuniting with Rosie and his kids as the movie closes out on the exact line that closed out the books.
Well, I'm back.
And with the closing of Sam's door, we finally say goodbye to Middle-earth. Alright, hold on, give me a sec. I gotta recuperate after all of that. That was huge. And audiences felt the same wave of emotions as the credits began to roll, set to Into the West, performed by Annie Lennox. On top of that, the credits this time were different from the first 2 movies. Where the first 2 movies simply featured white text on a black background, this movie uses tons and tons of drawings by Alan Lee and John Howe to bring the whole trilogy back to the 2 people who inspired so much of the look of these movies. They even did special portraits of each of the lead actors, giving them all a proper send-off for this emotionally charged and deeply thrilling conclusion. And finally, the last drawing scene as the credits come to a close is a drawing of the One Ring, as we fade out on this massive story one last time. Critical reception to Return of the King was perhaps the best it had been for the entire trilogy. Audiences and critics alike were swept up in this massive journey and felt the emotional wallop of this movie's conclusion. That, and audiences could now view this entire trilogy as one massive entity. The story had been told. The years of effort that had been poured in was now out there for the world to see, and audiences could only come away with one conclusion. This was perhaps the most successful blockbuster undertaking of all time. Due to the sheer size of the production, it's amazing it didn't fall off the rails. It's amazing that the whole thing kept on track from start to finish. And as a result, Return of the King rounded out what many would describe as the greatest film trilogy of all time. The characters, the story, the world, it all worked together to transport audiences into an adventure they had never seen before. And boy were they eating it up, because once again surpassing the box office hauls of the previous 2, Return of the King stormed across the box office with a whopping $377 million domestically and an absolutely astounding $1.1 billion worldwide. That's right, billion with a B. The world of Middle-earth had swept up audiences the world over as a fantasy story that could appeal to anyone at any time. But it wasn't just the box office that was heaping praise onto this third installment, because award season came around once again in the early months of 2004. where, following suit on the previous two movies, Return of the King was nominated for a grand total of 11 Academy Awards. But getting nominated is one thing. Even though the last two movies had received their fair share of Oscar nominations, they didn't win them all. But this time, Return of the King would have a slightly different fate. Across the entire ceremony, the film was awarded Best Visual Effects for Jim Rigel, Joe Letteri, Randall William Cook, and Alex Funke. Best Sound Mixing for Christopher Boyes, Michael Semenick, Michael Hedges, and Hammond Peake. Best Original Song for Fran Walsh, Howard Shore, and Annie Lennox. Best Original Score for Howard Shore. Best Makeup for Richard Taylor and Peter King. Best Film Editing for Jamie Selkirk. Best Costume Design for Nyla Dixon and Richard Taylor. Best Art Direction for Grant Major, Dan Henna, and Alan Lee. Best Adapted Screenplay for Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens, and Peter Jackson. Best Director for Peter Jackson. And finally, the biggest award of the night, presented by Steven Spielberg, Best Picture.
It's a clean sweep. The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, Barry M. Osborne, Peter Jackson, and Fran Walsh producers.
Return of the King broke records, holding the single biggest clean sweep in film history. 11 nominations, 11 wins. It was and still is unprecedented. And the entire crew was ecstatic. Their hard work had paid off. They had worked tirelessly for nearly a decade to bring these stories to the screen. And they had come through to win every Academy Award they were nominated for. And while these awards may technically be for Return of the King alone, because of the concurrent production and continuous effort on all three films, these awards could also be recognized as achievements for the entire trilogy. But even after the show, Oscar night wasn't quite over yet. While there is often an after party with all of the celebrities, the cast and crew of Return of the King decided to skip out on that to instead go to a fan party run by the website theonering.net. With all of the Oscars in hand, the crew decided to celebrate with the fans who helped carry these films to fruition. It wasn't just the film's awards, it was theirs as well. And after a huge night, after a celebration that the cast and crew would remember forever, after all of their hard work had paid off, after the industry and fans at large had awarded them the highest honors for the creation of this trilogy, the book was finally closed on The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, okay, here we go, and roll camera. And action! 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Actually, the journey wasn't over just yet. In fact, even after the Oscars, some of the crew reunited for one final shot to complete the extended edition DVD.
We've already won the Academy Award for this film. We don't need to get all kind of funny about it, do we?
The crew just didn't want to leave Middle-earth, and thankfully for them, the extended cut of Return of the King gave them all one last chance to spend time in this universe. But even that journey must come to an end, as on December 14th, 2004, nearly an entire year after the theatrical release, the Return of the King Extended Edition was finally released on DVD. This time with nearly an hour of additional footage, including, right up top, the infamous final confrontation with Saruman. The full dialogue scene that had been so much trouble was now finally available to watch for all, and it manages to bring a nice sense of closure to an aspect that was otherwise left open in the theatrical version, as this scene brings about the death of Saruman and the death of Grima Wormtongue. From here, the movie continues to expand with more fun moments like a drink-off with Legolas and Gimli, which even features a small Howard Shore cameo, which is fun. The action sequences are given some extra moments of flair and violence. A lot of conversations have been expanded or added in. Aragorn and Éowyn share another conversation, as do Éowyn and Merry on the way to Minas Tirith. There's more time spent admiring the glory of Minas Tirith, as well as some additional story regarding the white tree that lies at the center of the courtyard. The paths of the dead are greatly expanded, as we see the long journey Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli take to reach the army of the dead. And we also see the army make their decision. We see them join forces with our heroes before they arrive in Pelennor Fields. There's also a bit of an expansion into the Corsair ships and the crew that mans them, a crew made up of cameos of a lot of the people who worked on the movie, including Gino Acevedo, Richard Taylor, Andrew Lesney, Rick Porras, and of course, Peter Jackson. While you can see them briefly in the theatrical version, the extended cut greatly expands on this scene, showing their cameos in their full glory.
Injury!
But the most significant additions come after the Battle of Pelennor Fields and before the final stand at the Black Gate. There's a whole sequence where, after defeating the Witch King, Éowyn is deathly injured and is needed to be cured of whatever effects the Witch King's death had on her, which also features a song sung by none other than Liv Tyler. It's a song that was initially set to feature in the theatrical version during the scene where Arwen sees a vision of Aragorn and their son, but it ultimately didn't fit. So instead, when the time came for the extended edition, the song was brought back to kind of tie Arwen and Éowyn together, as Éowyn fully recovers after the battle, which also leads to a larger hint towards Faramir and Éowyn getting together, uniting the peoples of Gondor and Rohan. Meanwhile, on their way to Mordor, Frodo and Sam are caught in a pack of orcs, and while their armor disguises them, they still have to find a way out of this pack in order to make their way to Mount Doom. And of course, outside of the Black Gate, there's a pretty big scene where Aragorn, Gandalf, and the others come across the mouth of Sauron. This creepy and eerie character with an unnaturally large mouth. The prosthetics are fantastic, and the visual effects used to enhance it are also fantastic. But most significantly, what this scene adds is the fact that after the encounter with Shelob, Sauron got his hands on the mithril worn by Frodo, which tells the others that Frodo's mission has failed. They now believe that Frodo is dead, and that the ring is on its way to Sauron. It's a moment that adds an even bigger emotional punch to the line,
"For Frodo."
As these characters know for a fact that they will not survive, and yet they continue to fight regardless. And then it adds even more when the ring is finally destroyed, and they all collectively realize that Frodo is alive, and that his mission is complete. Ultimately, the movie concludes the same way, still with the 30 minutes of resolution, and right at the very end, like the first two, the credits transition to a list of all of the fan club members who helped make these movies a reality. It's a big final thank you to the fans who were supportive of these movies from start to finish. Like the previous two, the extended edition of Return of the King adds a great deal to the story, and once again it allows you to spend just that much more time in this universe and with these characters. Where the theatrical versions are a constant sprint to get from one place to the next, the extended trilogy plays more like a marathon, and by the end you yourself have gone through the same emotionally overwhelming journey as the heroes, which helps make the ring's destruction at the end all the more satisfying. And with Return of the King's extended release, audiences and fans now had the entire complete trilogy at their disposal, the entire journey in the palm of their hands. A trilogy that would go down in history. It was the first time 3 movies had been shot at the same time, the first time something this massive had been filmed entirely in New Zealand, and the first time the entirety of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was adapted to the big screen. I say that a little liberally, considering how much these movies wound up cutting out or changing, but that does inadvertently make this one of 2 distinct versions of this story. You have J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings in written form, and now there's Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, the big screen adaptation. The Lord of the Rings trilogy is truly a spectacle to behold. Every single aspect of the production, from the scripting to the design to the visual effects, music and sound design, everything all comes together to form a cinematic experience unlike anything else. It's a trilogy that utilized all of the best tools that had been perfected over the last 100 years, and also created and evolved tons of new tools, helping to push the world of film into the digital age. And now, even 20 years on, the stories of this world are still sweeping us away at every turn. Because of the timelessness of the story, Lord of the Rings will always persist. New generations will always be able to get involved in the story of Frodo, Sam, and the One Ring to rule them all. It's a testament to the whole team that the trilogy came together this well. The entire crew was dedicated from start to finish, and it's felt on every inch of the screen. While some of those immense details aren't seen in the films themselves, the massively expansive Appendices would go a long way to show off the immense work that went into making these movies a reality. A massive 6-disc, 20-hour behind-the-scenes documentary that was instrumental for me in getting this video made. There's so much in there. There's a reason it's considered the gold standard of behind-the-scenes documentaries. And despite how in-depth I went with this video, there's still so much more in there that I could not possibly have the time to dive into. So I definitely recommend checking those out if you haven't. But this is it. This is the the end of my journey with The Lord of the Rings. And before I go, I want to thank you for taking the journey with me, for watching this entire video all the way to the end. But while I might be finished with The Lord of the Rings, I'm not quite done in Middle-earth, because next weekend, if all goes to plan, I will be back with an all-new retrospective on the Hobbit trilogy. So stay tuned for that. Until then, however, this will be the end of this video, and I will see you guys later.